The crowns of history shine bright, but their jewels are often soaked in shadows. Behind every royal portrait, the solemn gaze, the polished throne lies a ledger written not in ink, but in lives lost. Tonight, we strip away the gold and silk to uncover 30 rulers whose reigns turned into killing fields. Some you know, most you don't. But all left scars carved deep into human history. These are the 30 most murderous royals you never heard of, and their stories will follow you long after the screen goes dark. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a midnight descent into history's darker corners. And while you're here, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it on your clock right now? Because whether it's sunrise, midnight, or somewhere in between, these stories won't let you go. Xiuquan. Some kings rule by divine right. Xiuquan claimed divine DNA. He said he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and no, that wasn't a metaphor. It was a job title. His celestial resume included recurring visions, an angelic tour of heaven, and a mission to exterminate demons. The demons, unfortunately, were the Qing dynasty, and soon the heavenly kingdom of great peace was born, by which we mean a brutal theocracy soaked in blood. At first glance, Hong was an unremarkable failure. He flunked the imperial exams 4 times, a feat that could either crush a soul or, in this case, convince someone they were a literal messiah. After collapsing from illness following his 4th failure, Hong claimed to have died and been resurrected by God. When he returned, he was a new man, stern, sanctified, and ready to baptize China in fire. He founded a sect, rewrote the Bible, and outlawed opium, foot binding, alcohol, and curiously traditional Chinese culture. He created a militant utopia where men and women were strictly segregated, all property was shared, and dancing was probably a capital offense. In other words, it was Woodstock meets the Inquisition, with better banners and worse hygiene. But Hong didn't just want followers, he wanted converts, soldiers, zealots, and he got them, millions of them. The Taiping Rebellion, his holy war against the Qing, would become one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The body count? Conservatively estimated at 20 to 30 million. That's not a typo. That's more than World War I. That's more than the Black Death in some countries. That's the population of Australia twice. The death toll wasn't from battles alone. It was from starvation, disease, mass executions, scorched earth tactics, and a nationwide unraveling. Cities were reduced to cinders, fields burned, riverbanks lined with corpses. And still, Hong sent out more edicts about hairstyles and hymn singing, convinced his heavenly kingdom was just one victory away from paradise. And yet, he hardly led. By the time the war reached its boiling point, Hong had retreated to a palace in Nanjing, where he lived in increasingly delusional isolation. He issued poetic orders that made no military sense and ate only the most holy foods. When his enemies finally surrounded him, he didn't lead the charge. He starved in his sanctum, refusing to believe the end had come. But the real horror wasn't that Xiuquan believed he was God's chosen. It was that millions of others did too, enough to tear an empire in half, to make the Yellow River run red, to turn one man's dream of salvation into one of humanity's greatest nightmares. The scientists tried to explain it. Some called it mass hysteria. Others saw economic desperation. The Qing dynasty was crumbling, the people were starving, and Hong offered a vision warped, yes, but clear. Still others point to charisma, propaganda, and the strange human weakness for certainty. But none of them can fully explain why so many marched to their deaths in the name of a man who renamed himself the Heavenly King and built a divine bureaucracy that ran on terror, gospel, and court arts. In the end, Hong's empire fell not with a holy trumpet blast, but with internal betrayals, scorched rice paddies, and Qing cannons. The heavenly king died in 1864. Some say poison, some say hunger, some say divine abandonment. His corpse was cremated and its ashes scattered to prevent any shrine from rising. But what do we make of a man who thought he was Jesus' little brother and then convinced millions he was right? How do we measure belief when it's backed by bayonets? And more disturbingly, what if he wasn't the only one? Because just a few centuries earlier, another man rode out from the steppe not to save the world, but to own it. His name was whispered with dread from Europe to China. His legacy: empires in ruins, cities erased, and pyramids made of skulls. He didn't claim to be God's brother. He just acted like God didn't matter. Genghis Khan. Imagine an empire stitched together by arrows and ambition. A man who began as a fugitive orphan and ended as a storm cloud that drenched half the world in conquest. Genghis Khan didn't start out with a throne, he carved one from the spine of the steppe. And unlike Xiuquan, he didn't need divine visions. He had horses, tactics, and an unshakable certainty that everything that moved could, and probably should, be conquered. Born as Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan began life on the outside looking in. His father was poisoned by rivals, his clan abandoned him, his family nearly starved. But hardship didn't crush him. It taught him one fundamental truth: loyalty is earned through fear or reward, preferably both. And so, Temujin rebuilt, slowly, patiently, like ice melting into floodwater. He didn't just unify the Mongol tribes, he reorganized them, burned their old allegiances, and made them part of something new. A war machine that respected merit over bloodlines, discipline over chaos. His soldiers could ride 100 miles without rest, sleep in the snow, fire arrows backwards at full gallop. In the chaos of medieval warfare, they were an alien force, fast, brutal, and precise. But Genghis wasn't content with winning tribal skirmishes. He wanted to break cities, empires, civilizations. And he did. Between 1206 and 1227, Genghis Khan's campaigns tore through northern China, Central Asia, and Persia. The numbers are staggering. Entire cities razed, populations vanished. Ancient libraries gone in a single siege. It's estimated that somewhere between 40 and 60 million people died during the Mongol conquests, not all directly under his sword, but many through famine, disease, displacement, and the long, rippling effects of total systemic collapse. That's 1 in every 10 humans alive at the time. Historians still debate the exact whole numbers from medieval chroniclers, tend to veer toward poetic exaggeration. But even with conservative estimates, the scale is apocalyptic. And what's more chilling is that Genghis didn't see this as cruelty. He saw it as strategy. He believed that terror was a tool the faster a city surrendered, the fewer arrows he'd have to waste. Resistance was a moral failure. Submission was efficiency. To the Mongols, it was business. And yet, for all the destruction, Genghis Khan also built. Or at least, he cleared the space for building. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, allowed trade routes to flourish across Eurasia. Ideas, goods, and diseases traveled faster than ever before. Merchants and diplomats could move from Venice to Beijing under the Khan's protection. It was civilization by fire. First burn it down, then draw a map on the ashes. He created a postal system, standardized weights and measures, promoted religious tolerance not out of idealism but pragmatism. He wanted loyalty, not liturgy. His administration was lean and ruthless, but functional. And therein lies the mystery. How do we reconcile the destroyer and the administrator, the city-leveling warlord and the proto-globalist reformer? One scholar's tyrant is another's accidental modernizer. Was Genghis Khan a genocidal maniac or the engine of Eurasian connectivity? The answer is both, or neither, or worse. It doesn't matter. Because Genghis didn't care what history would say. He didn't think in legacy. He thought in terrain, troop counts, and surrender timetables. When he died in 1227 suddenly, during a campaign against the Western Xia, he left no monumental tomb, no pyramids, no statues. His body was buried in secret. The location was never found. According to some tales, the funeral escort killed everyone they passed to preserve the mystery. True or not, the symbolism is potent. A man who remade the world, then vanished into it. Scientists have tried to trace the impact. Demographers argue over mortality rates. Geneticists point out that a staggering percentage of men in Central Asia carry DNA markers linked to Genghis's lineage, possibly as many as 1 inch 200 men worldwide. He may be the most biologically successful man in human history, a legacy written not in ink, but in chromosomes. But there's still something unresolved. Something that lingers beneath the heroic bronze statues and sanitized historical documentaries. It's not just the death toll. It's the way he made the world smaller, colder, more efficient. He showed that civilization is thin, that a few well-organized cavalry units could erase it. That law and literacy are no match for momentum. And if Xiuquan was a firebrand cloaked in scripture, Genghis Khan was the storm that needed no justification. His gospel was velocity. His commandment was victory. Still, for all his firepower, Genghis left a vacuum, one his successors couldn't fill. Because after the storm, something stranger rose from the ashes, a rebellion not of warriors or messiahs, but of court officials and eunuchs, jealousies and grievances, personal vendettas dressed up as ideology. It was led by a man who may have been blind, may have been a traitor, and may have accidentally sparked the deadliest civil war on record. His name was in Lushan, and what followed was something that even Genghis would have called excessive. An Lushan. He was obese, charismatic, possibly illiterate, and somehow rose to command the largest army in the Tang dynasty. An Lushan had 3 things you don't normally find in the same room: the trust of the emperor, the suspicion of the court, and the loyalty of an army big enough to change Chinese history. He also had a flair for dramatic betrayal, which is really saying something in an era where poisoning your uncle was just called Tuesday. Born of mixed Sogdian and Turkic descent, An Lushan didn't fit neatly into Tang China's ruling elite. He wasn't polished, he wasn't subtle, but he was magnetic, a physical presence known for performing mock dances and routines at court, charming his way into imperial favor like a stand-up comic with a sword. Emperor Xuanzong adored him. So did the emperor's infamous concubine, Yang Guifei, who referred to him affectionately as her adopted son. And if that sentence doesn't immediately raise a few red flags, it should. By the mid-8th century, An Lushan commanded troops on the empire's northern frontier. He was given control of 3 major military regions, a move that, in hindsight, was like handing a tiger your house keys because he promises to guard the refrigerator. Court officials warned Xuanzong. He's gaining too much power. He's ambitious. He's dangerous. Xuanzong waved them off. He trusted An Lushan completely. Until An Lushan marched 200,000 troops into the empire's heartland and declared himself emperor of a brand new dynasty. In 755, the An Lushan rebellion began and China broke in half. What started as one man's grab for power unraveled into a nationwide implosion. The rebellion lasted nearly 8 years. It cost, by some estimates, over 13 million lives. Older, more inflated accounts pushed that number to 30 million or higher, a gap mostly explained by missing census data, famine deaths, and migration. Regardless of the exact figure, one thing is painfully clear. This was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and certainly the most catastrophic internal rebellion China had ever seen. And Lushan didn't live to see the end of it. He declared himself Emperor of the Yan dynasty, moved into the imperial palace at Luoyang, and soon began acting like a paranoid despot, blind, bitter, and lashing out at imagined traitors. In 757, he was assassinated by his own son. Patricide, they called it. Dynasty management, his son probably called it. And still, the war raged on for another 5 years. The thing is, and Lushan's rebellion wasn't just violent, it was disorienting. The Tang Empire had long been viewed as a golden age of Chinese culture, poetry, art, cosmopolitanism. But all that fell apart when cities were razed, rice fields were abandoned, and civil servants traded pens for swords. For a while, nothing made sense. Government ministers became warlords, monks took up arms. Refugees wandered across a landscape that had once been the most sophisticated bureaucracy on earth, now just roads leading to nowhere. Historians still argue over what triggered it. Some say it was the Tang's over-reliance on foreign generals. Others blame internal corruption, decadence, the growing power of eunuchs at court. Some point to the fact that the military system was stretched too thin, the economy too dependent on tax revenues that vanished with each burned province. But the truth may be simpler and darker. One man, given just enough power, can break a nation. Modern scholars don't talk about Lushan as much as they talk about what came after. The Tang dynasty survived technically, but it never recovered. The central government weakened, bandits ruled the countryside. The dazzling cultural capital of Chang'an became a shadow of itself. Poetry written after the rebellion is noticeably more cynical, more melancholic, obsessed with themes of decay, impermanence, and the absurdity of power. There's a certain bitter irony here, and Lushan, the man who performed comedic skits for the emperor, accidentally became the tragic punchline to an empire's grand story. He rose through charm and betrayal, and died in the ruins he helped create, not as a hero, not even as a villain, but as a grim reminder that loyalty is often a performance, and power is always a wager. And yet, as devastating as Lushan's rebellion was, it didn't stand alone. Because just a few centuries later, another emperor would rise in the twilight between dynasties and usher in one of the longest, bloodiest transitions in Chinese history. A man crowned not for his charisma or vision, but by conquest, plague, and dynastic collapse. His name would be nearly forgotten outside China, but the consequences of his reign would echo through 25 million deaths. His title was simple, Emperor, but history remembers the transition he helped unleash as nothing short of catastrophic. Shunzhi Emperor, with Regent Dorgan, later Kangxi. History rarely pauses to admire transitional governments, but sometimes, in the quiet between dynasties, you'll find the deadliest parts of the story not in coronations, but in collapses. The Ming-Qing transition wasn't a battle. It was a long, unsteady avalanche, with bodies buried beneath banners. And at its center stood a child emperor, a calculating regent, and a dynasty that rose through ashes rather than applause. The Shunzhi Emperor was 6 years old when he became the first Qing ruler to sit on the throne of a fully conquered China. But let's not pretend he had any real power. The real force behind the throne was Dorgan, his uncle. a Manchu prince and regent who led the final campaigns against the remnants of the Ming. Dorgon didn't wear a crown, but he made imperial decisions with imperial authority. A shadow emperor, dressed in silk and strategy. Their reign began in 1644, but the transition had started decades earlier. The Ming dynasty was collapsing under the weight of economic dysfunction, corruption, famines, and a series of increasingly ineffective emperors. When a rebel army led by Li Zichang captured Beijing, the last Ming emperor hanged himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City, a fittingly theatrical end to a regime known for ceremony over substance. But instead of a new Chinese-led dynasty taking over, the power vacuum invited the Manchus in. They were outsiders, northern nomads, who had slowly built a political and military machine of terrifying efficiency. When Dorgan entered Beijing with the Shunzhi Emperor in tow, it wasn't liberation, it was consolidation. The Qing dynasty had arrived, and with it came a body count. Historians estimate between 20 and 25 million people died during the Ming-Qing transition. This wasn't a single war, it was a mosaic of rebellions, purges, military campaigns, and famine spirals that rippled across decades. Ming loyalists launched desperate resistance movements in the south. Former generals defected, switched sides, then defected again. Cities were burned, retaken, and burned again. Civilians were caught between shifting front lines that respected no neutrality. Dorgan, though often overlooked in popular history, was a meticulous architect of conquest. Under his leadership, Qing forces pursued rebels across China, suppressing uprisings with swift and ruthless efficiency. He implemented the infamous Q order, which forced Han Chinese men to adopt the Manchu hairstyle shaved front with a braided ponytail in the back or face execution. It was less about fashion and more about dominance, a visible marker of submission to a foreign rule. And yet, for all the devastation, there was also design. The Qing weren't simply raiders. They wanted to govern. They studied Chinese bureaucracy, Confucian ritual, and classical literature with almost obsessive intensity. Dorgan died in 1650, leaving the young Shunzhi to rule in his own right. His reign was short, he died at 22, but his son, the Kangxi Emperor, would eventually become one of the longest reigning and most revered emperors in Chinese history. But make no mistake, that stability was bought with unthinkable human cost. During the consolidation period, waves of peasant rebellions rocked the countryside. Whole regions were depopulated. The Qing military campaigns in the southwest against Ming loyalist strongholds turned towns into ghost cities. Drought and disease followed wherever order broke down. And unlike the rapid fire of a modern war, this suffering unfolded over decades, slow, suffocating, and impossible to escape. So why don't we talk about it more? Partly because the Qing succeeded. They rebranded the story. The horrors of conquest were tucked behind civil service exams, Confucian temples, and imperial painting scrolls. The dynasty emphasized harmony, tradition, and prosperity. But dig beneath the surface, and the foundations are soaked in the trauma of transition. And scientists, economists, historians, they've tried to track the ripples. The NBER published analyses showing that the demographic collapse during this period was one of the most severe in Chinese history, worse in some provinces than even the Taiping Rebellion. Climate data suggests that El Niño patterns worsened famines, war-induced agricultural failure multiplied the toll, but all of that is just analysis. The truth is simpler and more haunting. An empire fell, and another replaced it, but people disappeared in the middle. It's not the drama of a battlefield. It's not the spectacle of rebellion. It's the slow suffocation of a nation in limbo, where each decision, each betrayal, each forced march, Each clipped cue was just one more turn of the screw. The Shunzhi Emperor may have died young, and Dorgon may have been posthumously stripped of honors, but the world they created endured. Their dynasty would rule for nearly 3 centuries, but its roots were fertilized with the ashes of another China. And just when the empire thought it had found solid ground, just as the Qing had reasserted control and restored rituals, another conqueror emerged from the west. Not a bureaucrat, not a child emperor, but a whirlwind from the 14th century who thought order was weakness and destruction was a kind of perfection. His name echoed across continents, and his footsteps were marked not in footprints, but in entire cities wiped from memory. They called him Timur, but history remembers him by another name, Tamerlane. Timur, Tamerlane. If Genghis Khan was the storm, Timur was the aftershock, smaller in size, but far more unpredictable. He wasn't a Mongol, not exactly, not a Muslim scholar, though he quoted the Quran. Not an emperor by birthright, but a conqueror by sheer force of will. Timur, or Tamerlane as Europe came to call him, was a man in love with contradiction, a patron of the arts who left smouldering ruins in his wake, a self-proclaimed restorer of empire who dismantled every kingdom he touched. Born around 1336 near Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan, Timur claimed descent from Genghis Khan's family not directly, but close enough to justify his ambitions to the people who still revered the Mongol legacy. His origin story is cloaked in half-truths and myth. He may have started as a petty thief, a tribal enforcer, or a local strongman. But what is clear is that by his late 20s, he had mastered the politics of the fractured Chagatai Khanate and was poised to forge a new empire from the wreckage of the old. And forge it he did with fire, steel, and a cold, strategic genius that still baffles historians. Timur's campaigns were not chaotic rampages. They were ruthlessly calculated. He used terror as theatre. Cities that resisted were made examples of. Cities that submitted were folded into his bureaucracy, taxed, and if lucky left standing. His empire stretched across Persia, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, parts of India, and into Anatolia. From the late 1372 to his death in 1405, Timur's forces launched campaign after campaign, sparing few and fearing no one. The numbers attached to his conquests are staggering. Modern estimates attribute approximately 17 million deaths to his wars, and while that figure is debated, the scale of destruction is not. Entire regions were depopulated, infrastructure collapsed, trade routes turned to dust. Timur didn't just defeat armies, he dismantled economies, erased resistance, and left power vacuums that wouldn't be filled for generations. But here's the unsettling twist. He thought he was building something. Timur styled himself as the heir to both the Mongol world order and the Islamic Golden Age. He commissioned grand mosques, observatories, and palaces in Samarkand. He brought artists, scientists, and architects from conquered cities back to his capital, sometimes voluntarily, often not. The irony? Samarkand became a center of science and culture, while the rest of the empire burned. It's hard to reconcile. He ordered the deaths of thousands in Isfahan, then used the spoils to fund the construction of one of Central Asia's most beautiful madrasas. He reduced Delhi to chaos in 1398, then turned around and held philosophical debates in court a year later. So what was he? A barbarian in scholar's clothing? A reformer with a scimitar? Historians have tried to pin Timur down for centuries. Some describe him as a proto-nationalist, building a Central Asian identity rooted in Islam and conquest. Others see a man so obsessed with legacy that he couldn't distinguish building from breaking. He quoted scripture in battle speeches, but cared little for religious consistency. His enemies were as likely to be Muslim rulers as Christian ones. What mattered wasn't belief, it was control. Even his death is laced with irony. In 1405, Timur set out on yet another campaign, this time against the Ming dynasty of China. It would be his most ambitious campaign yet, and almost certainly a disastrous one. But before the army could cross the mountains, he died in Otrar, likely from illness brought on by the cold. His grand invasion never began, his troops turned back, and just like that, the man who spent a lifetime in motion stopped. His empire unraveled within decades. His descendants ruled fragments of territory, most notably the Mughal Empire in India. But the cohesive whole, Timur's brutal, glittering empire, vanished almost as quickly as it had emerged. Scientists and demographers still debate how to categorize his impact. Was it genocide? Was it systemic warlordism? Was it the delayed collapse of Mongol infrastructure? Satellite imagery of abandoned cities and ghost settlements across Central Asia offers silent testimony to the scale of what he left behind. And yet, his tomb in Samarkand still stands, the Gur-e-Amir, crowned with blue tiles and Persian poetry. For all the destruction he sowed, Timur built a monument to permanence. He wanted to be remembered. And in a way, he got what he wanted. But remembrance is not the same as understanding. Because even centuries later, we still struggle to explain how a man could speak of paradise and leave only wreckage, how he could quote philosophers while torching cities, how he could believe, sincerely, that empire was a kind of divine art and conquest, the only brush worth using. And if Timur was the artist of annihilation, then what do we make of the man who followed him? A ruler not of deserts and steppe, but of Europe, not cloaked in silk, but in the robes of the Holy Roman Empire. A man who didn't claim divine blood, only divine purpose, and whose war would turn the heart of Europe into a centuries-long echo of fire, famine, and fractured faith. His name was Ferdinand. And the 30 Years' War was only the beginning. Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor. If Timur ruled with iron certainty and a taste for destruction, Ferdinand II ruled with faith, or rather, with the weaponization of it. He was not a warlord or a frontier general, he was a trained theologian in royal armour, a devout Catholic who believed that divine order began with obedience and ended with fire. His war was not personal, not exactly, but it became one of the longest and most senseless religious conflicts in European history. And he started it by doing something seemingly harmless, revoking someone else's religious freedom. Ferdinand of Styria, as he was before, becoming Holy Roman Emperor, was born into Habsburg privilege in 1578. From a young age, he was educated by Jesuits, and taught that Protestantism wasn't just a rival doctrine, but an existential threat. This was post-Reformation Europe. After all, a continent that had turned theological disagreements into national crises. To Ferdinand, Protestantism was heresy, and heresy was a cancer. By 1619, Ferdinand had become Emperor Ferdinand II of the Holy Roman Empire, and his first order of business was unification through purification. He intended to roll back Protestant rights, reinforce Catholic orthodoxy, and restore Habsburg dominance over the patchwork of German principalities that made up the empire. This plan had one fatal flaw: nobody else agreed. Protestant nobles in Bohemia rebelled. You may have heard of their opening act, the Defenestration of Prague, where imperial officials were literally thrown out of a castle window. They survived, but the symbolism didn't twell. Bohemia declared Ferdinand deposed and replaced him with a Calvinist king. What followed was 30 years of devastation, involving nearly every major European power. It started as a local rebellion and metastasized into a pan-European religious war, a civil war, a dynastic conflict, and an early experiment in international power politics all rolled into one. The 30 Years' War, 1618–1648, wasn't a single clean narrative. It was a chaos collage, shifting alliances, religious rhetoric, masking territorial ambition, mercenary armies roving the countryside, and treaties broken as fast as they were signed. Ferdinand II insisted it was about Catholic restoration. France, a Catholic power, joined the Protestant side out of pure strategic spite. Sweden invaded the German states not to save souls, but to expand its influence. Spain, already bleeding from its empire, joined in and bled more. And amid all this, Central Europe became a graveyard of ambition and unintended consequences. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 4.5 and 8 million people died during the 30 Years' War. This wasn't an era of large, clean battlefields and heroic cavalry charges. Most of the deaths came from disease, starvation, and societal collapse. Fields went untilled, trade routes disintegrated, armies lived off the land, which meant draining it dry, villages disappeared, local economies broke under the weight of passing war bans, peasants who'd never read a Bible died in a war sparked by how it was interpreted, and at the heart of it all was Ferdinand II, steadfast, unshakable, and, depending on your viewpoint, either principled or catastrophically inflexible. He believed it was his sacred duty to restore Catholic unity in his realm. But faith, when fused with politics, often becomes something colder, less redemptive, more administrative. Ferdinand oversaw brutal re-Catholicization campaigns, signed off on the dispossession of entire Protestant communities, and saw compromise as weakness. Yet Ferdinand didn't see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as a steward, a man tasked with cleaning up the spiritual mess of the Reformation. The war, in his eyes, was regrettable but necessary. A cleansing fire that would return the empire to divine order. And by the time the Treaty of Westphalia was signed in 1648, Europe had changed. The Holy Roman Empire still existed, but its authority was gutted. The concept of religious uniformity as a political goal was quietly buried. Sovereignty now meant something new. The right of rulers to determine the religion of their own realms and the acceptance that no single faith would dominate forever again. Historians look back at the 30 Years' War and see the birth of modern diplomacy, the early stirrings of the nation-state, the end of medieval Christendom. But all that theory can't quite hide the smell of rot that lingers in the historical record. The letters from starving villagers, the population maps with missing towns, the poets who stopped writing because their cities no longer existed. Ferdinand died in 1637, 11 years before the war ended. He didn't live to see the peace he helped necessitate, or the ruin he helped engineer. His legacy is complicated. Like most legacies forged in fire and ideology, he thought he was preserving Europe, but in reality, he helped break it open. And the saddest part? The scale of death wasn't even unique, because a generation later, another emperor would rise not in the name of faith, but in the name of empire itself. A man who traded Catholic crosses for imperial eagles, and whose war would sprawl across Europe with a different kind of fervor. Ambition disguised as destiny, conquest dressed up in reason. His name was Napoleon, and his war would rewrite every border it touched. Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, "History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. He should know he spent most of his career rewriting it." Depending on whom you ask, Napoleon was either a brilliant architect of modern Europe or a glorified warlord in a silk cape. But what's often forgotten, buried beneath marble busts and military anthems, is the staggering human cost of his ambition. Between 1803 and 1815, during the Napoleonic Wars, an estimated 3 to 6 million people perished. These weren't just soldiers falling in neat lines on famous battlefields. These were also civilians, caught in the ripple effects, the starvation, disease, forced conscriptions, shattered economies, and social systems turned upside down by a man who crowned himself emperor and then made everyone else bow to the idea. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Napoleon didn't start as a tyrant. He started as a Corsican outsider with a chip on his shoulder and an uncanny knack for artillery. Born in 1769 to a relatively minor noble family, Napoleon grew up watching France and most of Europe fall into ideological, political, and literal pieces. The French Revolution had beheaded its king, turned its calendar upside down, and declared war on monarchy itself. In the power vacuum that followed, armies were desperate for talent. Napoleon supplied it. By 24, he was a general. By 30, he was ruling France. By 35, he had crowned himself Emperor of the French, in a ceremony that looked like a Catholic mass choreographed by a control freak. He didn't just take power, he manufactured myth. His rise was a masterclass in self-branding, one part Julius Caesar, one part Enlightenment reformer, all wrapped in the language of rational progress. But behind the reforms, and there were many, came the armies. Big ones. Napoleon's military machine was unlike anything Europe had seen since the Roman Empire. He introduced new systems of conscription, coordination, and mobility. His armies could move faster, strike harder, and recover quicker than any of their adversaries. But all that speed came at a cost. His wars spanned nearly every major European power: Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, Britain. Every time he conquered a new territory, he installed a puppet regime, redrew the borders, restructured the laws, and drafted the locals into his ever-growing military. Napoleon's campaigns weren't just frequent, they were relentless. He fought over 60 battles during his career, many more than the combined lifetime tallies of Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Frederick the Great. Each one carried a toll, not just in bodies but in the fraying of Europe's political fabric. The social order that had defined Europe for centuries cracked under the weight of his reforms and invasions. Take the Peninsular War in Spain, a brutal conflict that dragged on from 1808 to 1814. Napoleon had tried to install his brother Joseph as king. The Spanish resisted. What followed was a long, grinding campaign of occupation, guerrilla warfare, reprisals, and economic collapse. Some historians consider it an early form of total war, not because of its scale, but because of how deeply it affected the civilian population. Famine spread, cities were devastated. The Spanish monarchy never fully recovered. Then there was the Russian campaign of 1812. Napoleon invaded with over 600,000 troops, the largest army Europe had ever seen. By the time he limped back across the frozen border, fewer than 100,000 remained. The reasons are many: logistical overreach, scorched earth tactics, bitter winter, but the result was clear. Europe's most powerful man had broken his army against a land he thought he could bend. Yet Napoleon's genius was that he kept coming back, even after exile, even after defeat. In 1815, he returned from the island of Elba and ruled for 100 days before being decisively beaten at Waterloo. That final defeat earned him a one-way trip to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would die quietly and bitterly, in 1821. Modern historians are still trying to untangle the contradictions. Napoleon gave France its civil code, centralized administration, and secular schools. He abolished feudal privileges and promoted legal equality, at least in theory. But he also reinstated slavery in French colonies, censored the press, and crowned himself like a man, afraid someone else might forget whose empire it was. His wars shattered monarchies, but also inadvertently paved the way for new ones. He spread revolutionary ideals while crushing revolutions. He claimed to represent the people while ruling as an emperor. And above all, he left behind a Europe littered with graves and reeling with change. The scientists and analysts look back and point to the effects: demographic shifts, economic realignment, the rise of nationalism. They say Napoleon's wars taught Europe that no single man should be allowed to redraw the map unchecked, but that lesson would not be learned, not entirely, not permanently. Because even as Europe buried its dead and drafted new treaties, another king ruled a land far removed from the courts of Versailles and Vienna. A man who wore no laurel wreaths, but rubber-stained gloves. A monarch whose domain wasn't France or Spain, but the Congo. His war wasn't fought with battalions. It was outsourced, franchised, and brutalized through silence. And its death toll? Arguably higher than Napoleon's, possibly as high as 10 million. His name was Leopold II, and his empire was carved not by conquest, but by permission. Leopold II, King of the Belgians. Leopold II never led armies into battle. He didn't shout across a battlefield or ride through a smoking capital on horseback. His weapon was bureaucracy. His battlefield was paperwork. His uniform was a tailored suit worn in the marble halls of European diplomacy. And yet, from the late 19th to early 20th century, millions died under his personal rule, far from Brussels, in a land he never truly belonged to, the Congo Free State. If Napoleon made conquest a public performance, Leopold made it a private enterprise. He was not interested in glory for Belgium, not exactly. He was interested in possession, the kind where a man's name appears on a deed and no one dares to read the fine print. When the scramble for Africa began in earnest, with European powers carving the continent into pieces like a Sunday roast, Leopold saw an opportunity, not for Belgium, but for himself. And he took it. In 1885, the Berlin Conference granted Leopold personal control of the Congo Free State, a territory nearly 80 times the size of Belgium. It was not a Belgian colony. It was his private property, under the guise of philanthropy. He claimed he was there to end the Arab slave trade and bring civilization, Christianity, and commerce. The usual trifecta of 19th century justifications. But behind this moral wallpaper was a very different mission: rubber. The global demand for rubber exploded during the Industrial Revolution. Tires, telegraph cables, machinery, all of it needed latex. And in the Congo's vast forests, wild rubber was abundant. The only problem: extraction required labor, lots of it. And labor in Leopold's Congo was not voluntary. The system that emerged was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. Technically, Leopold wasn't issuing the orders. The administration was run by concession companies, privately owned entities given the right to extract resources and keep most of the profits, but they operated under charters signed by Leopold. They were accountable to his regime. They had one job: produce quotas, meet them, or face punishment. And punishment came in many forms. While historians continue to debate the precise death toll, credible estimates range from 1 million to as high as 10 million lives lost between 1885 and 1908. The lower numbers are considered conservative, based on demographic studies that attempt to reconstruct the missing. The higher numbers reflect the collapse of entire regions, villages emptied, populations never accounted for again. The cause of this catastrophe wasn't a single war or a central genocide. It was administrative violence, systemic coercion, and a vacuum of oversight. Villages were tasked with meeting impossible rubber quotas. If they failed, colonial agents raided their food stores. If resistance was suspected, hostages were taken. Entire communities were uprooted to force labor migration. The toll wasn't always immediate. Often, it was the long arc of collapse, famine from destroyed crops, disease and overworked populations, and social fragmentation that shattered generations. But perhaps the most disturbing part is how quietly it all happened. Leopold mastered the art of image management. In Europe, he presented himself as a philanthropist, a civilizing hero. He commissioned reports, sponsored humanitarian congresses, and erected statues of himself that still stand today. He once declared, "I undertake the work in the interests of civilization and for the well-being of the natives." Behind closed doors, however, his correspondence told a different story. Letters revealed an obsession with profit margins, a cold indifference to the suffering on the ground, and a stubborn insistence that the world not interfere. For over 2 decades, the Congo Free State was run like a grotesque business, and Europe largely looked the other way. Eventually, word leaked out. Missionaries and whistleblowers documented the atrocities. Photographs emerged. Public pressure grew. And in 1908, the Belgian Parliament forced Leopold to cede control of the Congo to the state. But by then, the damage was done. Infrastructure had been laid: railroads, ports, administrative centers, but not for the benefit of the Congolese. They were built to extract, not to sustain. The bones of empire, polished to look like progress. Leopold never apologized. He died in 1909, unloved even in his homeland. His funeral was met with jeers. Crowds turned their backs as the procession passed. Belgium, it seemed, had begun to understand what kind of man he truly was. Not a builder, but a broker of silence. A king who built an empire not with conquest, but with contracts and quotas. And still, in history's great ledger, his name often fades into the margins, overshadowed by louder tyrants, bloodier conquerors. But his legacy lingers in the quiet devastation he left behind, in the shape of modern Congo's fractured history, and in the moral vacancy that allowed so many to look away. Because while Europe debated humanism and civilization, the Congo disappeared beneath the weight of extraction. But as one empire of silence crumbled, another rose this time, back in China, where an emperor barely older than a schoolboy, flanked by an iron-willed Empress Dowager, would oversee another crisis. One not of conquest or ideology, but of rebellion, collapse, and millions more vanishing into the folds of history. Tongzhi Emperor, with Empress Dowager, CIX. The Tongzhi Emperor ruled in name. His mother, Empress Dowager CIXI, ruled in everything else. And though history books often frame their reign as a brief, confused lull in the dying years of the Qing dynasty, that lull was anything but peaceful. Beneath the lacquered surface of the imperial court, the ground was already trembling. In the northwest, entire provinces were sliding into chaos. And before anyone could stabilize the throne, millions were gone swallowed not by war, but by something harder to categorize: the slow-motion collapse of order itself. This wasn't the kind of catastrophe that makes history books easy to write. It didn't begin with a declaration or end with a treaty. It was less a war than a fracturing, a tangle of grievances, sectarian tensions, and delayed revenge. The event historians now call the Dungan Revolt, 1862-1877, unfolded during the Tongzhi Emperor's reign. And like many tragedies of imperial China, it began with a local dispute, then scaled into calamity. The emperor, for his part, was just a child 5 years old when he ascended to the throne in 1861. His father, the Shenzhen Emperor, had died young, leaving the Qing court in disarray. Into that vacuum stepped his mother, Cixi, a former concubine turned political juggernaut, whose unofficial regency would stretch for decades. But at this early stage, even Cixi didn't have complete control. The Qing state was battered, barely breathing after the devastation of the Taiping Rebellion. Its treasury was empty, its armies fractured, its provincial governors practically autonomous. And so when the Dungan Revolt erupted in the northwest in today's Gansu, Shanxi, and Xinjiang, the court was caught off guard. The spark was deceptively small, a dispute between Hui Muslim traders and Han officials, but that spark landed on a landscape primed for combustion. Decades of ethnic tension, economic inequality, and religious distrust had already built up in the region. Once fighting began, it spread like a storm through the Muslim-majority towns and the surrounding Han communities. The Qing response was uneven. In some regions, they tried negotiation. In others, they deployed troops. But with the central government still weakened, much of the fighting was left to local governors and generals, many of whom pursued their own agendas. Armies were hastily raised, often poorly supplied and barely loyal. In many areas, the fighting collapsed into village-by-village civil war, with alliances shifting based on survival, not ideology. And the cost? Conservative estimates place the death toll in the millions. Some historians speak of tens of millions in lost population across the northwest, not only through direct violence, but through starvation, disease, and displacement. The term Dungan Revolt doesn't quite capture the scale. This was less a rebellion than a regional unmaking, where governance disappeared, infrastructure dissolved, and society atomized. Even after the rebellion was nominally crushed in 1877, the land didn't heal. The Qing sent General Zhuo Zongtang, better known in the West for the chicken dish, misnamed after him to reconquer Xinjiang. His campaign succeeded militarily, but left large swaths of territory scorched, depopulated, and traumatized. Refugees streamed across borders. Muslim communities that had lived in China for centuries were permanently fractured, their trust in the state shattered. And the Tongzhi Emperor? He barely lived to see any of it. In 1875, at age 18, he died under mysterious circumstances, officially from smallpox, though rumors of foul play circulated immediately. His reign is often footnoted as a transitional blip, overshadowed by his mother's rising power and the dynasty's long twilight. But the reality is more haunting. Under his name, one of the most lethal episodes in Qing history unfolded, almost unrecorded in the imperial memoirs. As always, historians have tried to explain it. Some point to the collapse of the banner system, which had once organized Qing military and administrative life. Others cite the court's obsession with ritual over reform, the post-Taiping economic depression, or the ethnic divisions that had long festered between Han, Hui, Uyghur, and other communities. But no single cause accounts for the magnitude of the unraveling. The Dungan Revolt was not just a rebellion, it was a symptom of something deeper, a dynasty that could no longer see its own provinces until they were already burning. Empress Dowager Cixi, of course, emerged from it all more powerful than ever. With her son dead and no clear successor, she maneuvered to install her nephew as the next emperor, a young boy who would rule as the Guangxu Emperor, while Cixi continued to hold the reins from behind the screen. And it would be under Guangxu's reign, yet again under Cixi's shadow, that China would face a different kind of catastrophe. Not rebellion, not conquest, But famine slow, silent, bureaucratically ignored. A famine that would kill over 10 million people, not because the land failed, but because the system designed to feed them had already collapsed. And once again, the emperor would be too young, the court too proud, and the warning signs all too familiar. Guangxu Emperor, with Empress Dowager Cixi. By the time the Guangxu Emperor took the throne in 1875, China was already aging out of its old stories. The dragon still curled across palace tiles, the court still followed Confucian rites, and Mandarin still recorded everything in calligraphy, but the empire's heartbeat was faltering. Railroads were seen as heresy. Clocks were distrusted. The world outside was industrializing, mobilizing, and colonizing, and the Qing were still debating calendar reforms. Guangxu was only 4 when he was chosen to succeed the Tongzhi Emperor, his cousin. In theory, this was a dynastic reset, a fresh start for a dynasty weighed down by decades of rebellion, invasion, and humiliation. But in practice, it was just a longer shadow of the same regency. Empress Dowager Cixi remained firmly in control. The boy emperor was a figurehead, a symbol to be protected, corrected, and, when necessary, sidelined. And yet, during his reign, or rather, during the period when his name was on the seal, one of the deadliest famines in Chinese history consumed the country. It started, as these things often do, with weather. Between 1876 and 1879, large swaths of northern China were gripped by a prolonged drought. Rivers shrank, crops failed, rain simply didn't fall. From the Yellow River Basin through modern-day Shanxi, and Hainan, harvests collapsed in sequence. But drought alone doesn't kill tens of millions. What turned this environmental crisis into a humanitarian catastrophe was the failure or refusal of the state to respond effectively. The Guangxu Emperor was still a child, but the Qing bureaucracy was not. It was vast, centuries old, and filled with officials trained in classical texts about the emperor's moral obligation to relieve famine. There were precedents, systems, manuals. But the system had eroded, the treasury was drained from the recent rebellions, local governors were overwhelmed. The imperial court, still reeling from its own internal power struggles, responded with a mixture of slowness, detachment, and ritualized concern. Charity was left to local elites. Grain shipments arrived late, if at all. Corruption siphoned off what little aid existed. Foreign missionaries reported families selling everything, then fleeing, then dying not from war, not from plague, but from the simple fact that no food arrived in time. The numbers are staggering. By conservative estimates, between 9 and 13 million people died. Some demographers argue for even higher totals when accounting for unrecorded deaths and population displacement. The region's population did not recover for decades. It was a famine not of scarcity alone, but of systemic failure, a slow-moving disaster made possible by bureaucratic inertia, imperial detachment, and climate fluctuation. But perhaps the most haunting detail is this. The Qing state saw itself as morally superior to the Western colonial powers, more humane, more orderly, more righteous. And yet, while Chinese peasants starved, the imperial court continued to stage elaborate rituals, stage-manage appearances of harmony, and debate the aesthetics of imperial memorials. Empress Dowager Cixi was infamous for her lavish renovations to the summer palace, funded, in part, by money diverted from the navy and disaster relief. Whether or not famine aid was explicitly repurposed, the symbolism stuck. Opulence above urgency. Historians have struggled to categorize this famine. Some frame it as an inevitable result of climate, a freak El Niño pattern amplified by bad luck. Others place it within a global pattern of Victorian-era famines, many of which coincided with imperial mismanagement and economic transition. Still others look squarely at the Qing state and ask, how many lives were lost not because of drought, but because of delay? The Guangxu Emperor, to his credit, would later try to reform the system. In 1898, as a young adult finally old enough to rule in name and possibly in deed, he launched the 100 Days Reform, a flurry of modernizing decrees aimed at saving the empire from its slow-motion collapse. He wanted railroads, Western education, constitutional government, but within months, CIXI crushed the reforms, placed him under house arrest, and reasserted her control. And so the man under whose reign tens of millions died in famine spent the last decade of his life imprisoned in his own palace, reading reports he could not act on, signing documents he did not author. He died in 1908, one day before CIXI. Some believe she had him poisoned to ensure a smooth succession. Others believe he had simply wasted away. Either way, his death was symbolic, a quiet end to a life of stifled intention, passive catastrophe, and unmet potential. But while China starved and the Qing tottered, other emperors took a different approach. They didn't just ignore suffering, they inflicted it with surgical precision. Across the steppe, one such emperor ordered the destruction of an entire people not because they rebelled, but because they existed in the way. His name was Qianlong. His empire was thriving. And what he did to the Dzungars still raises the question, how do you define a genocide before the word even exists? Qianlong Emperor. Qing. The Qianlong Emperor ruled one of the most expansive and culturally sophisticated empires in the world, a realm of jade scrolls, classical poetry, and exquisite lacquerware. Under his reign, Qing China reached the height of its territorial power and artistic achievement. The libraries were full, the porcelain flawless, the court ceremonies labyrinthine in their perfection. But behind the imperial grace was something darker, a campaign of eradication so thorough, so final, that modern historians still debate whether it was the first modern genocide. The target was the Dzungar Khanate, a powerful Mongol polity in Central Asia that had once dominated the western frontiers of the Qing Empire. They were no minor nuisance. The Dzungars had resisted Qing expansion for decades, launching raids, defying tribute demands, and keeping the western borders perpetually unstable. But by the mid-18th century, the situation changed. The Dzungars were weakened by internal conflict, disease, and leadership crises. And Qianlong seized the moment. Between 1755 and 1758, under Qianlong's direct orders, the Qing military launched a series of campaigns into Dzungaria, the region that now lies in modern-day Xinjiang. These were not just punitive expeditions, they were systematic. And they did not stop with military victory. Qianlong didn't merely want to conquer the Dzungars, he wanted to erase them. Contemporary Qing records make it chillingly clear. After the initial military successes, the emperor ordered his commanders to pursue a final solution: root out and annihilate the Dzungar population. Villages were depopulated, survivors were hunted down. Qing reports speak of eliminating the rebel element entirely, phrased in the antiseptic language of imperial governance, but unmistakable in intent. By the end of the campaign, estimates suggest that between 400,000 and 800,000 Dzungars were killed, either in combat, mass reprisals, or through starvation and disease triggered by scorched earth tactics. This represented the majority of the Dzungar population. Those who survived were scattered, enslaved, or absorbed into other communities. The Qing forcibly repopulated the region with other ethnic groups, Han Chinese, Hui Muslims, and Uyghurs, effectively wiping Dzungaria off the cultural and political map. Qianlong, for his part, was proud of it. He commemorated the conquest with stately inscriptions, court paintings, and victory poems. He declared that the Dzungars had brought their own destruction upon themselves through rebellion and treachery. In the imperial narrative, the campaign was framed not as an atrocity, but as a civilizing act, the elimination of a barbarous threat, the restoration of order to the frontier, and it fit perfectly into Qianlong's vision of empire. He saw himself as a universal ruler, heir not just to the Chinese dynastic tradition, but to the steppe conquerors like Genghis Khan. He spoke Manchu, wrote Chinese poetry, and styled himself as a sage king who united heaven and earth. The Dzungar extermination, in his mind, was part of that cosmic duty. A ruler does not merely defend the empire, he reshapes it. But modern historians view it differently. Some call it a demographic catastrophe, others a pre-modern genocide. There was no word for genocide in the 18th century, but the intent was unmistakable. The Qing leadership did not merely defeat an enemy, they destroyed an ethnicity. They rewrote the ethnic map of Central Asia with such finality that the Dzungars ceased to exist as a coherent people. Even today, the Dzungar name survives more as a historical footnote than a living identity. The lands they once ruled are now folded into China's Xinjiang Autonomous Region itself, a site of contemporary tension and state control. The echoes of Qianlong's conquest are still audible in the region's political geography, in the ghost outlines of erased borders and rewritten histories. So, how do we reconcile this with the image of Qianlong as a philosopher king? After all, this is the emperor who patronized the arts, commissioned encyclopedias, and produced poetry by the ream. His reign is remembered as one of stability and elegance. Yet he oversaw the deliberate annihilation of an entire people not as a moment of rage, but as policy, as strategy. It forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Refinement and cruelty are not opposites. Sometimes they are roommates. And sometimes, the more refined the state, the more efficient its violence becomes. The silks get softer, the swords get sharper, the words get colder. And Qianlong was not alone in this paradox. Because across the sea, in a different empire with its own aesthetic obsessions and war machines, another ruler was preparing a campaign that would dwarf the Dzungar tragedy in sheer numbers. Not an emperor in name, but in ambition. Not Mongol, not Manchu, but Japanese. And under his rule, Korea would become a battlefield. 1 million would die. And the man behind it all wasn't driven by faith or reform, but something much simpler: legacy. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he dreamed of conquest in brushstrokes and blood. Toyotomi Hideyoshi. If war were a theater, Toyotomi Hideyoshi would have directed it like a kabuki play, elaborate, symbolic, brutal, and perfectly timed. He was not born into power. In fact, he was barely born into stability. The son of a peasant foot soldier in 16th century Japan, Hideyoshi rose through ambition, cunning, and a razor-sharp instinct for hierarchy. He didn't inherit a legacy. He built one, brick by brick, until it spanned all of Japan. But when that wasn't enough, he looked outward toward Korea, then China, and imagined his name written across continents. The irony, of course, is that Hideyoshi unified Japan just in time to launch one of the deadliest wars in East Asian history, not to defend the homeland, not even to secure trade, but because, by the time peace had been achieved, he couldn't stand the stillness. Power doesn't like a vacuum. and Hideyoshi had just finished creating one. By the late 1582, after decades of civil war among Japanese warlords, the Sengoku period, Hideyoshi had done what many believed impossible: brought the country to heel. Samurai who once ruled their fiefdoms like kings now bowed in his court. Daimyos were shuffled like chess pieces, sword hunts disarmed peasants, class lines were frozen. Power was centralized under a single leader, not an emperor, but a kampaku, a kind of civilian regent who ruled with imperial blessing, but without imperial blood. And then he got bored. In 1592, Hideyoshi launched the first invasion of Korea, declaring that Japan would march through the peninsula, conquer the Ming dynasty in China, and rule all of Asia from Beijing. Historians have argued endlessly about what drove him. Was it personal megalomania? An effort to keep restless samurai busy? A bid to export internal instability before it boiled back over? Whatever the cause, the effect was catastrophic. The Imjin War, named after the year 1592 inch, the Korean calendar began with lightning speed. Japanese forces landed at Busan and swept north with shocking efficiency, seizing Seoul and then Pyongyang within months. The Korean military was disorganized, underprepared, and technologically behind the Japanese, who were now armed with matchlock guns introduced by the Portuguese decades earlier. Entire towns were overrun before messengers could deliver warnings. But what began as a rapid advance soon devolved into a brutal, grinding conflict. The Ming dynasty entered the war to support Korea. Korean naval forces, under the legendary Admiral Yi Sun-sin, cut off Japanese supply lines with brilliantly executed naval campaigns. The war bogged down into attritional battles and protracted stalemates. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow, and the civilians caught in between paid the price. And the price was steep. Modern scholars estimate that over 1 million people died during the two invasions, 1592-1598. This includes soldiers, civilians, and those who died from famine, disease, and displacement, the usual ensemble of consequences when armies carve through the land with no long-term plan. Korean sources describe cities reduced to ash, rice fields abandoned, and entire regions depopulated. Hideyoshi, safely back in Japan, micromanaged the war like a man playing chess with fire. He issued elaborate edicts, sent gilded letters to the Ming court, and demanded that his generals deliver conquest as if they were simply late with paperwork. His vision was both grand and disconnected, a pan-Asian empire, governed from a castle in Osaka, driven by ceremony, martial law, and reverence for his name. But even as the war dragged on, his body began to fail. By 1598, Hideyoshi was gravely ill. Realizing he would not live to see his dream fulfilled, he ordered a quiet withdrawal of Japanese forces from Korea. His commanders obeyed. They had no choice. When he died later that year, the war ended not with victory or defeat, but with the collapse of the reason it existed. The cost was incalculable. Korea's infrastructure was wrecked. Cultural artifacts were looted or destroyed. Population losses were severe. Hideyoshi's own regime, now under the control of regents protecting his infant son, would soon be overtaken by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would found a shogunate that ruled Japan for over 250 years, one built, in part, on the lesson that Hideyoshi's war had nearly broken the country. And yet, in Japanese history, Hideyoshi is not remembered solely as a reckless conqueror. He's remembered as a unifier, a reformer, a brilliant tactician. His castle still stands in Osaka. His laws laid the groundwork for early modern Japan. The horrors of Korea are there, but muted, recast as miscalculations rather than design. Which raises the deeper question: What do we do with leaders who achieve greatness through ruin? Because Hideyoshi wasn't trying to destroy Korea, he was trying to use it as a ladder, a symbol, a stepping stone to something larger, and in doing so, he shattered it. But if he used war as a tool of ambition, the next man on our list used it as a demonstration of power, cold, calculated, and apocalyptic. His empire stretched further than Hideyoshi could dream, and his army did more than march. It eradicated. He was a Mongol, a descendant of thunder and empire. His name was Hülägü Khan, and he rode not toward conquest but toward Baghdad. Hülägü Khan. If Genghis Khan carved out the empire, Hülägü Khan tested its limits. He wasn't the first Mongol to take the steppe's fury westward, but he was the one who unleashed it on civilization's beating heart. Not a warlord improvising his way across deserts, but a commander with blueprints, engineers, siege engines, and instructions passed down from the great Khan himself. His destination wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. And in 1258, he reached it. Baghdad, the center of Islamic culture, learning, wealth, and empire. Hülägü was a grandson of Genghis, brother to Kublai and Munka. In a family where inheritance meant not land but direction, he was sent west to subdue Persia, crush the assassins, and bring the Abbasid Caliphate to heel. His campaign wasn't a whim. It was planned with precision, launched with staggering logistics, and carried out with brutal discipline. He didn't bring just cavalry. He brought siege towers, Chinese engineers, Persian scholars, and supply chains that stretched across Asia. His mission? Expand the Mongol Empire to its southwestern frontier, enforce tributary rule, and break any kingdom that resisted. The assassins fell first, the Nizari Ismailis, famous for their mountain fortresses and targeted killings. Their strongholds, thought to be impregnable, collapsed under Hülägü's coordinated assaults. Once they were neutralized, the road to Baghdad was clear. Baghdad, then, one of the richest and most influential cities in the world, was not just a target. It was the target. For over 5 centuries, it had been the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. Its libraries were legendary. Its scholars shaped everything from astronomy to medicine to philosophy. But its defenses? Decayed. Its leadership? Overconfident. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, had refused to submit to Mongol demands. He had trusted in his city's status, its religious prestige, and the assumption that no one would dare. He was wrong. Hülägü arrived with a massive force, estimated at 200,000 troops, and a single demand: surrender. The Caliph hesitated. He tried diplomacy. He sent messages, then insults. Hülägü waited, briefly. Then he acted. What followed was one of the most infamous sackings in recorded history. Sources from the time Arab, Persian, European describe the fall of Baghdad with language usually reserved for natural disasters. Contemporary accounts estimate that between 200,000 and 800,000 people may have perished, though exact numbers are disputed. Even if exaggerated, the truth remains. It was not a battle, it was a collapse. The city was breached, its walls shattered by catapults and fire. The Caliph was captured. The Mongols, pragmatic but pitiless, executed high officials, burned libraries, destroyed canals, and turned Baghdad from a metropolis into a ruin. The Tigris reportedly ran black with ink from book collections dumped into the river. Some say it ran red too, but we are not here for imagery, we are here for consequence. The sack of Baghdad didn't just mark the end of a city, it marked the end of the classical Islamic Golden Age. For centuries, Baghdad had been a hub of scholarship, home to institutions like the House of Wisdom. After 1258, that legacy fractured. The Mongols moved on. The Caliphate never recovered. The region would rebuild in time, but the center had shifted spiritually, intellectually, geopolitically. And yet, Hülägü did not see himself as a destroyer. Like many Mongol commanders, he saw conquest as a tool of order. He spared scientists, engineers, artisans, anyone useful. He took Persian advisors, used Muslim and Christian allies, and built his own mini-empire in Iran and Iraq, later known as the Ilkhanate. He married into local dynasties, he minted coins. He stabilized trade. In other words, he followed the Mongol blueprint: destroy, then govern. But even among Mongols, Hülägü's campaign stood out. His invasion of the Islamic world created a permanent breach between the Mongol Khans and the Muslim powers. Many Muslims, even those who respected Mongol governance later, never forgave Baghdad. The trauma echoed for generations, in poetry, in politics, and in memory. Historians today still struggle with the contradictions. Was Hülägü a barbarian, or just a man fulfilling orders? A military genius, or a cynical instrument of empire? Was Baghdad doomed already weakened by its own internal rot, or was it obliterated unnecessarily, a victim of Mongol overreach? The question matters less than the aftermath, because in Hülägü's wake, there was a new map, a broken one. Trade would resume. Yes, Mongol governance in the Ilkhanate would bring temporary stability. But Baghdad, the intellectual beacon of the medieval Islamic world, would never again be what it was. And as Hülägü returned to his new capital, flush with loot and legacy, a different ruler across the continent in France would soon find himself caught in another kind of fire. Not one of conquest, but of religion. Not from abroad, but from within. Where brother turned on brother, noble turned on priest, and Paris turned on itself. His name was Charles IX, and his kingdom would soon run on fear, paranoia, and the wrong kind of faith. Charles IX of France. Charles IX was not meant to rule over an empire of ashes, but history rarely honors intention. He ascended the French throne in 1560 at the age of 10, following the death of his older brother. Young, emotionally fragile, and overwhelmed by the complexity of statecraft, Charles was immediately placed under the control of his mother, Catherine de' Medici, whose name would become synonymous with both Machiavellian cunning and France's darkest hours. The country he inherited was a tinderbox one spark away from religious civil war. That spark came fast, and the fires burned long. France, in the 16th century, was not a stable Catholic kingdom. It was a splintering state caught in the early throes of the Reformation. A sizable portion of the nobility had embraced Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, and called themselves Huguenots. They weren't just dissenters in the pews, they were political players, armed with militias, fortified cities, and royal blood in their veins. The Catholic establishment, meanwhile, saw the Reformation as heresy incarnate, and the monarchy, perched between both camps, teetered dangerously with every passing year. From 1562 to 1598, the French Wars of Religion consumed the country. Civil wars, plural, overlapping and compounding. Historians count 8 major conflicts interspersed with fragile truces, broken treaties, and retaliatory massacres. But the moment that came to define Charles IX's reign, the moment that scorched his name into the collective memory of France, occurred in the early hours of the 24th of August, 1572. The Street Bartholomew's Day Massacre. It began in Paris, just days after the politically calculated wedding between Charles's Catholic sister, Margaret of Valois, and the Protestant Henry of Navarre, a union meant to soothe the country's tensions. The guest list included Huguenot leaders from across France who arrived in good faith, hoping that the monarchy was finally moving toward tolerance. Instead, they walked into a trap. After an assassination attempt on Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a leading Huguenot figure and one of Charles's advisors, the royal court panicked or plotted, depending on which source you believe. What's agreed upon is this. Sometime that night, Charles IX gave the order, or, more accurately, he signed off on what had already been set in motion: the killing of Protestant leaders in Paris. A clean operation. A preventative measure. Swift, surgical, and containable. It was none of those things. What followed was an eruption. Catholic mobs, emboldened by royal sanction and inflamed by years of sectarian hatred, turned Paris into a killing field. Then the violence spread to Orléans, to Lyon, to Bordeaux, to Rouen. For weeks, Huguenots were hunted, and entire communities were purged. The death toll in Paris alone is estimated in the thousands. Across France, estimates range from 10,000 to 30,000, depending on the source and methodology. It was not just a massacre. It was a signal that reconciliation had failed, that faith had become a fault line. And Charles IX, whether he intended to or not, became its symbol. He reportedly suffered a breakdown afterward. Contemporary accounts suggest he was haunted by what he had authorized pacing the halls of the Louvre, muttering about blood. Whether that remorse was real or rhetorical is still debated. What isn't debated is that the massacre shattered any remaining possibility of peaceful coexistence under his rule. Trust was gone. The kingdom fractured. The wars intensified. Protestant leaders went underground or armed themselves further. Catholic extremists, especially the ultra-hardline House of Guise, pushed for even greater purges. The monarchy, already weakened, now found itself boxed in. Charles was just 18 when the massacre occurred. He died less than 2 years later, in 1574, racked with illness and psychological decay. Officially, it was tuberculosis. Unofficially, some said it was divine punishment. Others said it was guilt. But Charles IX's legacy wasn't defined by his life. It was defined by his failure to stop a storm he might have helped summon. He wasn't a tyrant in the mold of Timur or Hülägü. He was something more unsettling, a fragile monarch caught between powerful factions, manipulated, indecisive, and ultimately culpable through weakness. And therein lies the unresolved question. What do we make of leaders who let horror happen, not out of malice, but because they couldn't say no? The massacre didn't end the religious wars. It deepened them. It radicalized both sides. And the monarchy would never fully recover its credibility. France's wars of religion continued for another 2 decades, with each side convinced the other was irredeemable, each massacre answered by another. By the time peace finally came under a different king, a different century, the idea of a unified Catholic France had shattered beyond recognition. Yet even that chaos had limits. Because across the Channel, another king one, with sharper features and sharper theology, would ignite a civil war of his own. Not over doctrine, but over power itself, divine right, parliamentary law, authority, obedience. His name was Charles I of England, and his crown would not just slip, it would fall. Charles I of England. By the time Charles I was marched to his scaffold in 1649, dressed in black and speaking calmly to the gathered crowd, he had already become more symbol than man. A martyr to some, a tyrant to others, and to history something more complicated. He had ruled not with iron, but with certainty. And certainty, when paired with divine right, has a tendency to ignite civil wars. Unlike Charles IX of France, who drowned in chaos not of his own making, Charles I helped build his own storm. Not with swords, but with paper, taxation, and an unshakable belief that kings answer only to God. For years, he governed without parliament. For years, he insisted that royal prerogative trumped public grievance. And for years, England, Scotland, and Ireland, three kingdoms awkwardly stitched together, tried to pretend that this arrangement was sustainable. It wasn't. Charles was born in 1600, the second son of King James VI of Scotland, and I of England. He wasn't meant to be king. But when his older brother Henry died young, Charles was thrust into the spotlight. He was shy, awkward, deeply religious, and groomed with the heavy weight of divine authority. His father had famously said, "A subject may not challenge his king," and Charles took that mantra further. To him, monarchy was not a contract. It was a cosmic appointment. He became king in 1625 and married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, in a deeply Protestant nation. That alone would have been enough to raise suspicions. But Charles also surrounded himself with advisors the people distrusted, enforced religious reforms that leaned dangerously close to Catholic ritual, and levied taxes without parliamentary consent. His court grew increasingly isolated. Parliament grew increasingly furious. After repeated disputes, Charles did the unthinkable in 1629. He dissolved Parliament entirely. For 11 years, he ruled alone an era now called the personal rule, or, less flatteringly, the 11 years' tyranny. To fund his government, he revived obsolete taxes, fined nobles for minor infractions, and leaned heavily on forced loans. It worked for a while, but power built on avoidance is brittle. When Charles attempted to impose Anglican reforms on the Presbyterian Church of Scotland in 1637, the backlash was immediate and ferocious. Riots broke out. The Scottish lords formed a defensive covenant, and just like that, Charles had triggered a religious and constitutional crisis across all three of his kingdoms. Unable to suppress the rebellion without funding, Charles was forced to recall Parliament in 1640. But Parliament had changed. It no longer saw itself as a servant of the crown, it saw itself as a check on abuse of royal power. The resulting standoff metastasized into the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, a sprawling, interlinked series of civil wars in England, Scotland, and Ireland that would last a decade and kill over 200,000 people. A staggering toll for a population of roughly 5 million. The war was not simply Parliament versus King. It was factional, chaotic, and fluid. Royalists fought for tradition and monarchy. Parliamentarians fought for constitutional reform. The Scots fought for religious independence. The Irish, already devastated by plantation schemes and sectarian persecution, saw a chance to rise up and reclaim lost ground. And in the midst of it all, Charles refused to bend. Even after military defeats, even after imprisonment, even after escape and recapture, he negotiated in bad faith, believing that, eventually, his divine right would be recognized again. He made secret deals. He played rivals against each other. And all the while, the war dragged on. Eventually, Parliament's patience cracked. Radical factions, like the New Model Army, led by Oliver Cromwell, pushed for a final solution. Not exile, not abdication, trial. Charles I was tried for high treason against his own people, the first reigning monarch to face such a charge in Europe. The court, a legal construct with no precedent, found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. On the 30th of January, 1649, Charles stepped out onto a scaffold built in front of the banqueting house in Whitehall. He addressed the crowd not to confess, but to assert his innocence. "A subject," he said, echoing his father's doctrine, "is not bound to question his king." Moments later, the axe fell. His execution shocked Europe. Monarchs recoiled. If the English could kill their king, what did that say about divine order? What did it mean for monarchy itself? And yet, the killing of Charles didn't bring peace. The wars continued in Ireland and Scotland. Cromwell's republic turned into a military dictatorship. When monarchy was finally restored in 1660 under Charles's son, Charles II, the country had changed. The myth of divine, unaccountable rule was damaged beyond repair. Charles I left behind no empires, no libraries, no golden age. He left behind a question: what happens when power believes it is unaccountable? His war didn't begin with fire, it began with arrogance and ended with an axe. But even that seems measured compared to what came next. Because the next king on our list didn't just preside over a war. He reigned while his empire committed a planned campaign of forced removal so vast, so catastrophic, that the modern world gave it a name: genocide. And in the dying days of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed V sat at the top, silent, ceremonial, and presiding over the vanishing of a people. Mehmed V, Ottoman Sultan. By the time Mehmed V ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1909, the empire he inherited was already a shadow of its former self, brittle at the edges, bleeding in the Balkans, and increasingly ruled not by sultans, but by committees. His title was imperial, but his power was paper-thin. He was a ceremonial monarch placed atop a crumbling machine, a placeholder in a palace, while the real decisions were made by men in military uniforms and secret rooms. And during his reign, the empire oversaw one of the most horrifying episodes of state-directed violence in modern history: the Armenian Genocide. Now, to be clear, Mehmed V did not personally mastermind the genocide. He was not a ruthless commander or an ideologue. But that fact makes his role no less chilling, because Mehmed's reign reveals something even more unsettling: how much destruction can occur under the watch of a ruler who does nothing to stop it. The early 20th century was unkind to the Ottoman Empire. It had already lost most of its European territories in the Balkan Wars, suffered internal rebellions, and was increasingly seen by the European powers as the sick man of Europe. Into this fragile vacuum came the Committee of Union and Progress, a group of young revolutionaries who had once claimed to be modernizers, but gradually consolidated power into an authoritarian core. The real power behind the Ottoman curtain became the three pashas, Enver, Talat, and Cemal, military men and nationalist thinkers who believed that saving the empire required homogenizing it. To them, diversity was weakness. Unity meant purity. And so, when World War I broke out in 1914, and the Ottomans joined the Central Powers alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, these leaders saw an opportunity. Armenians, a Christian minority, long scapegoated within the empire, were now accused of being traitors, Russian sympathizers, and internal enemies. The stage was set, and Mehmed V sat on the throne smiling, posing for photos, and issuing edicts stamped with imperial flourish. In 1915, under the legal and political structure of his reign, the empire began what it euphemistically called the relocation of the Armenian population from eastern Anatolia. In reality, this was a coordinated, systematic campaign of deportation, starvation, mass killings, and cultural erasure. Whole villages were emptied. Intellectuals and leaders were arrested first, then executed. Men were separated from their families. Women and children were marched into the deserts of Syria with no food, no water, and no return. The death toll is still debated, but the scholarly consensus places it between 600,000 and 1.2 million Armenians dead between 1915 and 1917. Some estimates run even higher. The term genocide itself, coined decades later by Raphael Lemkin, was inspired in part by the Armenian case. It was not just a tragedy, it was a blueprint. And where was Mehmed V? Officially, he was Sultan and Caliph of Islam. In theory, he was the moral and spiritual head of the empire. He issued wartime declarations, including a call for global jihad against the Allied powers. He was informed of the deportations. He signed the decrees. He did not protest. He did not intervene. He died in 1918. 1 year before the empire's formal surrender and just months before the final collapse of the Ottoman state. Was he powerless? Perhaps. The CUP had seized effective control of the government, but symbolic power matters. His silence was not neutral. His participation, even if passive, lent legitimacy to a campaign that annihilated communities that had lived in Anatolia for centuries. The empire's edicts bore his name. The justifications cited his authority. And the machine rolled on. Even after the war, during the brief flickers of accountability that followed, Mehmed V's name was carefully preserved, his role sanitized. Trials were held, sentences were passed. But the empire dissolved before any meaningful justice could be carried out. The new Turkish Republic would later distance itself entirely both from the crime and from the Ottomans who allowed it to happen. And yet, the scars remain. To this day, the events of 1915 are remembered with grief, denial, outrage, and silence, depending on where you stand. Memorials mark where villages once stood. Survivors' descendants keep alive the names that nearly vanished. Scholars sift through telegrams, survivor accounts, and Ottoman archives, looking for the full story and for accountability that never came. Mehmed V is often remembered as a soft figure, a poet, a recluse, a man of ceremony. But history rarely forgives such passivity, because the horror of his reign was not just in what was done, it was in what was allowed. And as his empire cracked and his people scattered, another leader half a world away was rising from very different soil. Not a caliph, not a sultan. A king of warriors born in southern Africa, who would build his kingdom not through philosophy or genocide, but through relentless upheaval. His name was Shaka Zulu, and where he walked, kingdoms shattered not because he hated them, but because they simply stood in his way. Shaka, Zulu king. History remembers Shaka Zulu as a military genius, a revolutionary, a brutal king, and a tragic figure. But what history rarely does is pause to consider the scale of the transformation he unleashed. Because Shaka didn't just found a kingdom, he reshaped a subcontinent. He didn't inherit power. He constructed it from broken tribes, scattered loyalties, and raw fear. And in doing so, he triggered a chain of upheaval so vast and destabilizing that it still echoes across southern Africa today. The Zulu kingdom, as it came to be known, was not a product of empire in the traditional sense. It was a byproduct of displacement, a new order born from the Mfekin, a term that roughly translates to the crushing or the scattering. And at the center of this long, chaotic period stood Shaka, the illegitimate son of a minor chief who would become the most feared name in southern Africa by the 1822nd. To understand Shaka, you have to understand that he did not rise in a vacuum. The early 19th century in southern Africa was a time of profound instability. Population growth, environmental pressures, drought, and colonial encroachment were already putting traditional societies under stress. Tribes competed for land and resources. Trade with European settlers, especially in firearms, was beginning to disrupt old balances of power. Shaka stepped into this whirlwind and added a new variable: organization. He took the small Zulu clan, once a minor player among many, and forged it into an army state. Not a tribal confederation, a machine. Discipline was absolute. Loyalty was mandatory. Innovation was constant. He reformed military tactics, famously replacing the throwing spear, the shorter stabbing spear, ekwa, designed for close combat. He restructured regiments, imposed age-based military training, and introduced new formations like the buffalo horns, allowing flanking maneuvers that overwhelmed less organized enemies. These weren't just tweaks, they were systemic upgrades, and they worked. Tribe after tribe fell. Some were absorbed, others fled, still others resisted and were annihilated. Shaka didn't wage war for territory alone. He waged war to build unity through dominance, crafting a centralized kingdom from chaos. But the cost? Estimates vary and records are fragmented, but modern historians suggest that during the Mfekin, which Shaka both initiated and catalyzed, up to 1 to 2 million people may have died or been displaced across southern Africa. Some fled into barren territories to avoid conquest. Others were caught between warring factions. Entire communities were uprooted. Social structures were torn apart. What began as Zulu expansion became regional shockwaves, as rival leaders adopted similar tactics in self-defense or revenge. The Sotho, Tswana, Swazi, and Ndebele all were either drawn into the vortex or forced to react to it. This wasn't genocide in the modern sense. It wasn't colonization in the European sense. It was something in between. Internal imperialism, sparked by innovation, sharpened by trauma, and driven by a charismatic leader who saw mercy as a liability. And Shaka himself? He was a paradox. He was a brilliant strategist, yes, but also paranoid and increasingly erratic. He ruled with a combination of charisma and terror. He demanded absolute devotion and punished dissent with theatrical cruelty. Toward the end of his reign, following the death of his mother, Nandi, the only person he reportedly trusted, he became unstable. According to contemporary reports, some of them likely exaggerated by later colonial writers, he imposed harsh mourning rituals on his subjects, including bans on planting crops, drinking milk, or smiling. Whatever the precise truth, it's clear that his mental state deteriorated, and so did the loyalty of his inner circle. In 1828, Shaka was assassinated by his half-brothers Dingane and Hlangana, with the help of his bodyguard. Power passed, but the damage done and the new power structures he'd created could not be undone. The Zulu kingdom survived. For a time, it even thrived. But the region around it had been permanently transformed. The old tribal map of southern Africa had been torn to shreds and rewritten with blood. Shaka didn't just conquer, he reordered reality. And long after his death, colonial powers would find the political geography of southern Africa reshaped by the whirlwind he had set in motion. Historians still debate the legacy. Some portray Shaka as a nationalist hero, a unifier who resisted fragmentation and built something durable. Others emphasize the destruction, the displacement, the violence, and caution against romanticizing empire, even when it's not European. But perhaps both are true. Shaka was not a conqueror in the mold of Caesar or Napoleon. He did not rule by decree from a marble palace. He ruled with sand, steel, and proximity. And when he spoke, the land shifted. Still, even his reign, with all its fire and fracture, pales beside what came next. Because while Shaka's storms swept across the grasslands, another king far to the north, quietly starved his own people not by accident, but by design. His empire was elegant, his court was gilded, but his policy fed no one. His name was Louis XIV of France, and in the shadow of his golden palace, 2 million people died not from war, but from hunger. Louis XIV of France. They called him the Sun King, and for good reason. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he eclipsed it. For over 7 decades, his presence dominated Europe like a fixed celestial body, brilliant, remote, untouchable. His every gesture was ceremonial. His court at Versailles became the center of cultural gravity, where nobles orbited him in a ritualized ballet of bows, wigs, and whispered ambitions. He authored absolutism, or at least perfected its performance. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. And to many, he was. But behind the gilded mirrors of Versailles, the flickering candlelight of masquerade balls, and the carefully choreographed displays of divine right, millions starved. While Louis poured fortunes into wars, palaces, and operas, his policies, or more precisely, his neglect contributed to one of the deadliest famines in French history, a crisis that would unfold, not as a singular event, but as the cruel punctuation mark at the end of his reign. The famine of 1693-1694. It was, at first glance, an act of nature. Bad weather swept across Europe in the early 1692. Crops failed. Harvests dwindled. France, particularly in the north and the central provinces, experienced 2 consecutive years of agricultural collapse. But famine is rarely just about climate. It's about policy, distribution, and preparedness. And on those fronts, the kingdom of Louis XIV fell dangerously short. The war didn't help. France had been embroiled in the 9 Years' War, 1688-1697, a sprawling, expensive conflict against a coalition of European powers. It drained the royal treasury. It diverted grain for military use. It forced taxation to unsustainable levels. While Louis's troops fought in Flanders and on the Rhine, French peasants, the very backbone of the nation, were eating grass, bark, and boiled roots. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that between 1.3 and 2 million people died during the famine of 1693-94 in a country of roughly 20 million. That's nearly 10% of the population. Whole villages were depopulated. Birth rates plummeted. Children were abandoned. In some regions, families left their dead unburied for lack of strength to dig. And the worst part? Louis XIV was warned. Reports filtered up from provincial intendants, bureaucrats sent from Paris to manage the localities. They begged for grain shipments, for tax relief, for coordinated responses. Some suggested temporary price controls. Others recommended distributing royal reserves. Louis, while not completely indifferent, responded with lethargy. He sent instructions, delayed action, and often prioritized court protocol over rural urgency. Versailles was insulated by design. It was a palace of performance where hardship did not enter. While people in Auvergne and Burgundy died of exposure and hunger, the court continued with its feasts, its dances, its games of political chess. Nobles competed for the privilege of handing Louis his shirt in the morning. The gardens remained meticulously trimmed. The fountains flowed. The disconnect was not just economic. It was existential. The people of France had long accepted that monarchy was divine, that suffering was part of life. But this famine introduced a new kind of doubt. Not revolt, not yet, but cognitive dissonance. If the king was God's chosen, why was the land cursed? If the Sun King was France itself, why was France starving? Louis never addressed this question directly. He never apologized. He saw the famine, like the war, as a temporary hardship in the grand project of French supremacy. His gaze was fixed on legacy, and in a way, he got it. He left behind Versailles, military victories, and an administrative state that would survive his death. But he also left behind a traumatized countryside, a generation of children born into hunger, and a social contract stretched to its limit. France did not forget. The revolution wouldn't arrive for another century. But the seeds were being planted in bad harvests, in empty stomachs, and in the realization that kings could starve their people from behind silk curtains. Historians have tried to make sense of Louis XIV's role in the famine. Some argue that he was no more negligent than other rulers of his era. Others point out that his centralized bureaucracy gave him more tools than any monarch before him, and that his failure to use them was a moral and political decision. There's no consensus. But the irony is impossible to miss. The man who defined absolutism, who choreographed the monarchy into divine theatre, presided over one of the deadliest peacetime tragedies in French history. And yet, his famine was only a prelude, a warning tremor before the larger shocks of the 18th century. Because across the Mediterranean, another emperor was preparing to seize a city not with ceremony, but with cannons. His name was Mehmed II, and in 1453 he would break through the walls of Constantinople and end an empire that had lasted over 1,000 years. Mehmed II, Ottoman Sultan. When Mehmed II stood before the Theodosian walls of Constantinople in 1453, he wasn't just besieging a city. He was rewriting the final chapter of the Roman Empire, a book that had been open for over 1,000 years. Born of a Byzantine seedling and stretched across continents, the empire had survived crusades, plagues, and political decay. But it would not survive Mehmed. He was only 21 years old. They called him Fatih, the Conqueror. And though his youth might suggest impetuosity, Mehmed II was anything but reckless. He was methodical, multilingual, and obsessed with strategy. He read Aristotle and Plato, studied mathematics and siegecraft, and surrounded himself with advisors from both the Islamic and Christian worlds. But beneath his Renaissance polish was something older, the ambition of a warlord. Because Mehmed didn't just want victory, he wanted validation, the kind that could only come from toppling something ancient. To the Ottomans, Constantinople wasn't just a Christian stronghold. It was a symbol of a crumbling world order that needed to be replaced. The city was wealthy, strategically located, and spiritually significant, and it had stood unconquered for over a millennium. Until him. The siege of Constantinople began on the 6th of April, 1453, and lasted just under 2 months. The Byzantines, under Emperor Constantine XI, were hopelessly outnumbered, perhaps 8,000 soldiers defending a city against an Ottoman force of over 80,000. But the Byzantines had walls, 3 layers thick, nearly impenetrable, and legendary. Those walls had repelled dozens of invasions over centuries. Mehmed brought something new. He had cannons. More specifically, he had the Basilica, a massive bombard forged by the Hungarian engineer Orbán, capable of firing stone projectiles weighing over half a ton. It took hours to reload and had limited accuracy, but it was psychological warfare. Day after day, the Ottomans battered the walls. Night after night, they tried to undermine the city's defenses with tunneling, naval skirmishes, and relentless assaults. But the defenders held. For a time. Inside the city, food was running low. Morale wavered. Appeals to the West brought little. A few Genoese and Venetian ships slipped in with reinforcements, but Europe's great powers, distracted by their own rivalries, left Constantinople to its fate. On May 29, 1453, after 53 days, Mehmed ordered a final, massive assault. Wave after wave of soldiers surged forward, first the irregular troops, then the Anatolian corps, and finally the elite Janissaries. Exhausted and overwhelmed, the defenders broke. The Ottomans poured through a breach in the wall near the gate of Street Romanus. By mid-morning, the city had fallen. The death toll from the siege itself is difficult to pin down. Estimates range from tens of thousands. The population of Constantinople had already dwindled before the siege began. Once a city of nearly 500,000, it had shrunk to perhaps 50,000. Many died in the fighting. Many more fled, were enslaved, or disappeared into the wreckage. Churches were looted, palaces sacked. For 3 days, the conquerors were given license, as was customary in medieval warfare. But Mehmed had plans for the city. He entered Constantinople later that day, reportedly dismounting at the Hagia Sophia, now silent and stripped of its icons. There, he prayed not to desecrate the space, but to claim it. Then he issued orders. The city would be spared further destruction. It would become the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, renamed Istanbul, and rebuilt as a global center. Mehmed didn't just conquer Constantinople. He resurrected it. He offered incentives for Muslim, Christian, and Jewish populations to settle there. He restored churches and built mosques. He imported artisans, scholars, merchants. The Ottoman state became a multi-ethnic empire, autocratic but surprisingly cosmopolitan. And Mehmed, the boy sultan who had studied Homer and Herodotus, now ruled over a realm that blended east and west in unsettling symmetry. Still, the conquest had consequences far beyond the Bosporus. In Europe, the fall of Constantinople triggered panic. It was the end of Byzantium, the last vestige of the Roman Empire. Christian kingdoms feared a Turkish march into the heart of Europe. Papal calls for new crusades rang out, but too late. Trade routes shifted. Refugees fled west, bringing manuscripts, knowledge, and a cultural spark that helped fuel the Renaissance. In the Islamic world, Mehmed's victory was seen as a fulfillment of prophecy, the Sultan as the renewer of Islamic civilization. He took the title Caesar of Rome, Kaiser-i-Rum, and began a lifelong project of expansion, administration, and consolidation. He would go on to conquer Serbia, the Peloponnese, and parts of Anatolia, pressing the Ottoman frontier deeper into Europe. But for all his achievements, Mehmed was never seen as merely a builder. His legacy is still stained not only by the fall of Constantinople, but by his brutal campaigns in the Balkans, where populations were displaced and resistance was crushed. Hundreds of thousands died during his broader conquests. The man who turned Istanbul into a jewel did so by hammering the borders of his enemies into dust. And so we are left with a familiar contradiction, a visionary wrapped in violence, an emperor who ended an empire and birthed another, a man who revered the classics while smashing the world that preserved them. But Mehmed's empire would live on for centuries. His walls would be reinforced. His mosques still stand. His image, carved into marble, debated in textbooks, softened in legend. And yet, for all his might, he could not control what would come after him, how empires forget, how legacies erode. Because just as Mehmed reshaped the city, another ruler in the frigid north was reshaping the soul of Russia. He didn't pray in cathedrals, he screamed in them. He didn't build palaces for peace, he built them for paranoia. They called him Ivan the Terrible, and that was the mild version. Ivan IV, the Terrible, Tsar of Russia. There are rulers who earn their epithets through legend, others through propaganda. And then there's Ivan IV of Russia, Ivan the Terrible, who earned his title the old-fashioned way, with policy, paranoia, and a trail of shattered institutions. His name survives not as myth, but as a kind of warning etched into the bones of Russian memory, carved into cathedral domes and whispered in the foundations of the modern state. But the irony is that Ivan didn't begin as a tyrant. He began as a child surrounded by chaos. Born in 1530, Ivan ascended the throne at just 3 years old, after his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died unexpectedly. The Russian nobility, known as the boyars, immediately began a slow-motion feeding frenzy, treating the child Tsar as a symbol to be controlled, not a sovereign to be respected. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, died mysteriously when he was 8. Poison was suspected. Ivan spent much of his youth watching power play out through court intrigue, assassination, and humiliation. And he remembered. He internalized. At age 16, Ivan did something no Russian ruler had done before. He crowned himself Tsar of all Rus, not just Grand Prince. It wasn't just a title upgrade, it was a theological rebrand. Tsar came from Caesar, and with it came a vision. Ivan was no longer just a prince among nobles. He was a divinely appointed autocrat equal to emperors, answerable only to God. Russia, in his mind, was the Third Rome. The early years of his reign offered hope. Ivan introduced legal reforms, created a standing army, the Streltsy, modernized governance, and expanded the power of the central state. He commissioned the Domostroy, a guide to moral and domestic conduct that blended orthodoxy with patriarchal rigidity. He even summoned a Zemsky Sobor, a kind of proto-parliament. For a moment, it looked like Ivan might be a modernizing force. Then came the breaking point. In 1560, his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died suddenly, likely poisoned. Ivan was devastated. But his grief metastasized into something more volatile: obsession, suspicion, and retribution. He blamed the boyars, whom he had never truly trusted. He withdrew from public life, lashed out at advisors, and declared war not on foreign enemies, but on his own elites. And thus began the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan formally split the Russian state in two: the regular government, administered by traditional nobles, and his own personal territory. Ruled directly by him and enforced by the Oprichniki, a private corps of black-clad enforcers who acted more like inquisitors than soldiers. They rode black horses, dressed in black robes, and carried brooms and dog heads on their saddles to sweep away treason and sniff out enemies. Their real job: surveillance, intimidation, and execution. Over the next 7 years, Ivan's Oprichniki terrorized cities, executed nobles, and confiscated land under the pretense of rooting out betrayal. The campaign culminated in 1570 with the sack of Novgorod, a wealthy, semi-autonomous city Ivan suspected of plotting defection to Poland. What followed was a massacre. Entire families were dragged into the Volkhov River, frozen and drowned. The city's churches and archives were looted. Thousands, possibly tens of thousands, died or fled. And the message was clear: no one was beyond suspicion. The Oprichnina devastated the Russian economy. Trade collapsed. Agriculture suffered. The nobility, once the primary stabilizing force in governance, was hollowed out. Ivan had centralized power, but he had poisoned the apparatus that sustained it. And all the while, foreign wars raged. Ivan's Livonian War, 1558-1583, aimed at gaining access to the Baltic Sea, became a prolonged ruinous conflict against a rotating cast of enemies. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Sweden, and remnants of the Teutonic Order. Russia gained nothing. The treasury was emptied, the peasantry was overburdened. And when famine struck in the 1572, it hit a country already on the edge of collapse. By the 1582, Ivan had aged into a shadow of the monarch he once was, violent, unmoored, and tragically isolated. In 1581, he struck and killed his own son in a fit of rage, possibly the only heir with the competence to rule. The event shocked the court and became immortalized in a painting by Ilya Repin centuries later, Ivan the Terrible and his son, depicting the Tsar cradling his dying child, eyes wide with horror at what he had done. Ivan died in 1584, reportedly while playing chess. His death marked the end of the Rurikid dynasty. What followed was the time of troubles, a period of famine, foreign invasion, and dynastic uncertainty that would leave Russia leaderless and bleeding for over a decade. So what do we make of Ivan? He built the foundations of the modern Russian state. He expanded the territory dramatically, subjugating the khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, opening Russia's gateway to Siberia. He standardized administration and projected imperial authority in ways no Russian ruler had before. But he also destroyed trust in governance. He replaced rule of law with rule of fear. And he taught the nation that power, once threatened, would do anything to preserve itself, even if it meant devouring its own children. And as the ashes of his reign settled, another king was quietly overseeing a war of attrition, not in Russia, but in the Netherlands. A war so long, so bitter, and so ideologically entangled that it birthed a new kind of monarchy, one that ruled through bureaucracy, not charisma. One that outsourced brutality instead of owning it outright. His name was Philip II of Spain, and his war lasted 80 years. Philip II of Spain. To understand Philip II of Spain, you must begin with silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the chilling kind, the kind that lives in palaces made of cold marble, the kind that follows a command issued in ink but delivered by fire. Philip was a king of distance. He didn't lead from horseback. He ruled from paper, parchment, and architecture. His famous El Escorial, the royal monastery palace near Madrid, was part fortress, part tomb, and part administrative hub. Inside, he worked in a plain wooden chair for hours each day, surrounded by religious iconography, imperial maps, and the echo of his own isolation. Where others ruled with charisma, Philip ruled through control. And the crown he inherited was not a kingdom, it was a network of empires. Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy, the Low Countries, the Americas, the Philippines, all under one man's authority. And with that authority came one of the longest, most grueling, and morally convoluted conflicts in European history, the 80 Years' War. At its core, it was a rebellion. But it evolved into a war of identity, ideology, and attrition, one that would kill hundreds of thousands and reshape the map of Europe. The setting was the Low Countries' 17 provinces that included modern-day Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. These lands were wealthy, urbanized, and strategically vital. They were also, by the mid-16th century, growing restless under Spanish rule. Protestantism, especially Calvinism, was spreading. Local nobles were increasingly agitated by Spanish taxes and the heavy-handedness of royal governors. And Philip II, unlike his father Charles V, had no interest in compromise. To Philip, there was no grey area. He was a Catholic monarch in the Age of Reformation, and he believed it was his divine duty to crush heresy wherever it appeared. He centralized authority, sent in troops, and appointed the Duke of Alba, a man whose name would become synonymous with repression, to enforce orthodoxy and obedience. The result was predictable. Resistance hardened. In 1566, Protestant mobs iconoclastically destroyed Catholic symbols across churches. In response, the Duke of Alba arrived with 10,000 soldiers and a new tribunal, the Council of Troubles, quickly nicknamed the Council of Blood. Thousands were executed. Entire cities were punished. The nobility was terrified, but instead of suppressing the revolt, Spain had galvanized it. By 1568, the Netherlands erupted into open war. It began as a rebellion led by William of Orange, a former noble who turned against Philip and became the face of Dutch resistance. What followed was not a neat war with clear fronts. It was a patchwork of sieges, ambushes, religious cleansing, and attrition. Towns switched sides. Armies starved more often than they fought. Civilians bore the brunt of the violence. Famine and disease stalked every campaign. And through it all, Philip never wavered. He micromanaged the war from afar, dictating troop movements and financial allocations from his monastery palace. But he also overstretched his empire. Spain was bleeding money wars in the Netherlands, against the Ottoman Empire, and later against England. Remember the Armada? Drained the treasury. Inflation from American silver wreaked havoc on the economy. Soldiers went unpaid, rebellions multiplied. The Dutch, meanwhile, evolved. Their struggle morphed from a noble-led revolt into a national war of independence. The northern provinces declared themselves the Union of Utrecht in 1579, a de facto breakaway republic. In 1581, they formally abjured Philip's rule, declaring that a king who failed his subjects had forfeited his right to govern. Radical stuff for the 16th century. And the war kept going. Even after Philip's death in 1598, the conflict dragged on under his successors. It wasn't until 1648, with the Treaty of Münster part of the broader Peace of Westphalia, that the war officially ended. The Dutch Republic was recognized as sovereign, and Spain was forced to let go of its most industrious provinces. So how many died? Precise numbers are impossible to determine, but modern estimates suggest several 100,000 deaths over the course of the conflict from war, famine, disease, and reprisals. Civilian casualties were particularly high during sieges, especially in events like the sack of Antwerp, 1576, where Spanish troops mutinied and slaughtered thousands. The economic devastation was equally severe, cities ruined, trade disrupted, and generations caught in an endless loop of military occupation and retaliation. And through it all, Philip's portrait never changed stoic, unsmiling, cloaked in black, hands folded over a rosary. He wasn't a bloodthirsty general. He didn't revel in cruelty, but he institutionalized it. His Spain became a machine for enforcement of doctrine, of order, of silence. The Inquisition expanded. Dissent became treason. Heresy became war. Philip II's legacy is not written in victories. His armada failed. His empire fractured. His wars drained the lifeblood of the Spanish treasury. But he did succeed in crafting a blueprint for state control that others would follow, a slow, grinding style of power that used bureaucracy instead of swords, paperwork instead of charisma. And perhaps that's the most dangerous kind of ruler. The one who never shouts, never marches, never breaks decorum, but still makes the walls close in. As the Netherlands smouldered and Spain sank under its own ambition, a very different kind of monarch was carving out authority across the English Channel. He didn't rule with files. He ruled with fire and famine against his own people in a land he had just claimed as his own. His name was William the Conqueror, and the north of England would never forgive him. William the Conqueror. He was born out of wedlock, mocked as William the Bastard, and raised in a duchy where betrayal was a form of communication. By the time he landed on the shores of England in 1066, William of Normandy had learned one enduring lesson. Power is something you take, not something you're given. History knows him best for the Battle of Hastings, where he defeated Harold Godwinson and secured the English crown. But that was only the beginning. The real transformation, the one etched into the soil of northern England, still whispered about in the annals of medieval terror, came after. A campaign so devastating that even the chroniclers of the time described it with a kind of moral nausea. It would come to be known as the Harrying of the North. Let's rewind. When William seized the English throne, it wasn't exactly a done deal. His claim was tenuous, built on oaths, papal backing, and, most crucially, the ability to win a decisive battle. But England wasn't a unified chessboard waiting for a king to make the first move. It was a fractured land of earls, local lords, and ancient grudges. And the North York, Northumbria, the old Danelaw had never been particularly interested in obeying southern authority, let alone a foreign one. In the first few years of William's reign, northern England became a hotbed of rebellion. Native Anglo-Saxon nobles, resentful of Norman rule, allied with Danes and even Scots to resist. William responded with military expeditions, building castles, crushing pockets of resistance, and replacing the old English aristocracy with Norman barons loyal to him alone. But the resistance didn't die. It adapted. The breaking point came in 1069 when Danish forces landed in the Humber estuary and joined forces with rebellious English nobles. The city of York, then the second largest in England, fell. Norman garrisons were slaughtered. The message to William was clear. This was not a rebellion. This was an existential rejection of his kingship. And William, who had never been a man to flinch, made a decision that would define the brutality of his reign. He would erase the North. Between the winter of 1069 and the spring of 1070, William launched a scorched earth campaign across Yorkshire and the surrounding shires. His army didn't just defeat rebel forces, it destroyed the land itself. Villages were torched, crops burned, livestock slaughtered, food stores confiscated or razed. Entire swaths of countryside were rendered uninhabitable. This wasn't medieval warfare. It was deliberate depopulation. Chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describe scenes of mass starvation, people eating roots and animals, and entire communities vanishing from the map. Monasteries were burned, churches desecrated. The Domesday Book, William's Grand Census, compiled years later, still recorded vast areas in the north as waste, meaning unproductive, depopulated, or both. The scars were literal. Historians estimate the death toll at anywhere between 20,000 to 100,000, depending on methodology. In an 11th century context, with a national population of just a couple of million, this was a staggering blow. Some regions never fully recovered demographically until the 12th century. Why did William do it? The coldest interpretation is also the most likely. Deterrence. William had won a crown through conquest, but keeping it required something more enduring fear. He needed England, especially its northern half, to understand that rebellion was not just punished, but obliterated, and it worked. There were no major northern uprisings after 1070. The land had been pacified, or more accurately, emptied. But even Norman chroniclers questioned the cost. Orderic Vitalis, writing from within the culture that revered William, described the campaign as a barbarous homicide that God would not forget. Others, more distant in time or loyalty, saw it for what it was, an act of terror executed not in a moment of desperation, but as a policy. And William? He did not seem haunted. He spent the rest of his reign consolidating power, building stone castles, reshaping England's feudal system in his image. He created the administrative machinery that would eventually become the English state. He summoned the Domesday Book in 1085, an extraordinary, even obsessive survey of his realm's resources, people, and land. It was not just a record, it was a manifesto of control. He died in 1087 in Normandy, after a military campaign. The chronicles say that his bloated corpse exploded when it was forced into a too small sarcophagus, a grotesque coda for a man who had carved his name into history with cold force. So, what was William the Conqueror? A founder, yes. A builder, undeniably. But also a man who saw population as a variable in a ledger, not a moral consideration. He understood that empires are not made by consent. They are made by reminding people permanently what happens when they say no. And if William saw rebellion as a threat to order, the next monarch on our list saw it as a personal affront to divine authority itself. A sultan who wielded faith and empire like twin blades and left rivers running red in the process. His name was AbdÃ×lhamid II, and his empire bled from within. AbdÃ×lhamid II, Ottoman Sultan. In the twilight years of the Ottoman Empire, when the machinery of imperial rule was rusted but still dangerous, AbdÃ×lhamid II sat at the helm, not as a reformer, not as a general, but as a master of fear and illusion. His rule, which stretched from 1876 to 1909, has long defied simple classification. To some, he was the last great sultan, a protector of the caliphate, a shrewd geopolitical chess player in an age of colonial wolves. To others, he was a paranoid autocrat, a man whose reign was defined by silence, censorship, and the stifling of dissent beneath the velvet cloak of religious legitimacy. But beyond the propaganda and palace intrigue lies something harder to refute. Under AbdÃ×lhamid's watch, the Ottoman Empire unleashed a wave of violence against its Christian populations, most notably the Hamidian massacres, between 1894 and 1896. The death toll, estimated at 100,000 to 300,000. The purpose? Both political survival and a deliberate reassertion of central authority in blood, if necessary. Let's set the stage. The Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century was an old house held together by curtains and denial. Its borders were shrinking. Its European neighbours, Britain, Russia, Austria-Hungary, circled like hyenas, eager to claim territory under the guise of protecting minorities. Inside the empire, a powder keg of ethnic and religious tensions simmered. Christians in Anatolia and the Balkans were agitating for reforms. Armenians, in particular, were growing restless, demanding better protection, representation, and a loosening of tax and land policies that often left them vulnerable to abuse by local officials and Kurdish tribes. Into this walked AbdÃ×lhamid not as a modernizer, but as a man who believed order must be imposed, not negotiated. He suspended the Ottoman constitution just 2 years after ascending the throne and dissolved the parliament. The empire became, once again, a sultanate in the purest sense. Power concentrated at the top, with every contradiction swept beneath the rug of divine mandate. When Armenian reform movements began to gain momentum in the 1892, some peaceful, others more radical, AbdÄ×lhamid responded not with policy but with pressure. He authorized the formation and arming of irregular Kurdish militias known as the Hamidiye regiments, ostensibly to patrol the eastern provinces. But in practice, these forces acted with impunity, raiding villages, intimidating civilians, and stamping out dissent in the name of unity. Then, in 1894, everything cracked. An uprising in the Sassoon region, where Armenians had resisted unjust taxation, triggered a chain reaction. The Ottoman military, along with Hamidiyye auxiliaries, descended on the region. What followed was not just a crackdown, it was a message. Over the next 2 years, waves of massacres spread across eastern Anatolia and even into major cities like Constantinople. Churches were burned. Entire communities were annihilated or forced to flee. The killings were often framed as spontaneous riots, acts of intercommunal strife, but the coordination, consistency, and timing revealed something more deliberate. Foreign missionaries, diplomats, and journalists reported widespread atrocities. The international press, especially in Britain and the United States, covered the massacres extensively. William Gladstone condemned AbdÃ×lhamid as the great assassin. Humanitarian campaigns were launched, funds were raised, but no intervention came. The European powers were too divided, too interested in preserving the geopolitical status quo to force the Sultan's hand. And so the violence rolled on, not as a flashpoint, but as a policy of fear. Armenians, once seen as a loyal and industrious minority, were now marked as a political liability. The empire would no longer tolerate ambiguity. You were either with it, or you were a threat. AbdÃ×lhamid never admitted responsibility. His court denied state involvement. He surrounded himself with layers of plausible deniability, a strategy he perfected across every aspect of his rule. He allowed palace informants to operate in every village and coffee house. He built a censorship apparatus so dense that even mentioning his name in print became a subversive act. Dissenters vanished. Intellectuals fled. Reformists were either imprisoned or forced underground. He didn't wear the brutality on his sleeve. He wore it like a second skin invisible, unless you knew what to look for. And perhaps that was his real genius. Not his military skill, nor his governance, but his ability to preside over chaos while appearing composed. The empire weakened under him. The rot deepened. But he gave it just enough cohesion to survive like a crumbling dam holding back the inevitable. In 1909, after a failed counter-coup and the re-establishment of the constitution by the Young Turks, AbdÃ×lhamid was deposed and exiled. He lived out his final years in a palace in Thessaloniki, watching the empire he had once ruled begin to unravel for good. But his methods would live on. The Hamidian massacres weren't an isolated tragedy. They were a dress rehearsal for the even more catastrophic violence to come under the Committee of Union and Progress, the architects of the Armenian genocide. In many ways, AbdÃ×lhamid provided the blueprint. Identify the problem, use paramilitary force, silence critics, and bury the evidence beneath the machinery of state. And while his hands were eventually pried off the levers of power, the legacy of what he allowed and arguably engineered would haunt the Ottoman corpse long after he was gone. But as the Ottomans stumbled into the 20th century, another empire older still, eastward and built on conquest, was tearing itself apart from within. In Persia, a warrior king once crowned in jewels returned from India with spoils beyond imagination. What he brought back, however, was not peace, it was revenge. And his name was Nader Shah, a man whose conquests left Delhi trembling and history pages scorched. Nader Shah, Afsharid, Persia. By the time Nader Shah crowned himself ruler of Persia in 1736, the Safavid dynasty had long since lost its grip. The once mighty empire, famed for its Shia orthodoxy and imperial elegance, had become a fractured mirror reflecting only what used to be. Foreign invasions, courtly corruption, and tribal chaos had reduced Persia to a series of rival provinces pretending to be a nation. Into this power vacuum rode a man of no noble birth, no royal lineage, a soldier, a bandit, a genius, and eventually a king. But king barely captures it. Nader Shah didn't just claim a throne, he dared history to stop him. And when it didn't, he left behind one of the most terrifying legacies of early modern Asia. Born around 1688 to a poor family in northeastern Persia, Nader Qoli Beg rose through the ranks the only way available to someone with nothing. He fought. Not just enemies, rivals, tribes, mercenaries, opportunists. His skill in battle was undeniable, but more importantly, he could command chaos. As the Safavid state crumbled under Afghan invasions and Ottoman advances, Nader offered more than resistance. He offered order, brutal, efficient, and utterly dependent on himself. By 1736, he had become so indispensable that he decided being indispensable wasn't enough. He deposed the last Safavid puppet and crowned himself Shah of Shahs, founding the Afsharid dynasty. But where most rulers might have consolidated power cautiously, Nader went on the offensive. His first act? To reclaim lost Persian territory and then some. He pushed westward against the Ottomans, securing victories in Armenia, Georgia, and Mesopotamia. He reasserted control over the Persian Gulf. He defeated the Uzbeks in Central Asia, but it was his Indian campaign that would cement his infamy. In 1738, Nader Shah launched one of the most audacious expeditions of the early modern world, an invasion of Mughal India, a land known for its riches, its decaying court, and its distracted emperor, Muhammad Shah. By then, the Mughal state had declined into a ceremonial shell. Court factions bickered, provinces acted autonomously, and the treasury was still swollen from centuries of wealth, exactly the kind of soft target a man like Nader noticed. The invasion was swift. Nader's forces marched through Afghanistan, crushed Mughal outposts, and reached Delhi by early 1739. The battle outside the city was brief. The Mughal army, poorly coordinated and overly confident, collapsed under Persian pressure. Nader entered the imperial capital not as a guest, not as a conqueror, but as something else entirely. A mirror, held up to a decaying empire, reflecting its own helplessness back at it. What happened next has become the subject of both historical record and political cautionary tale. Nader initially tried to present himself as magnanimous. He met with the Mughal emperor. He allowed the court to function. But rumors of a Mughal counterattack, real or fabricated, reached his ears. What followed was a calculated retribution, devastating and precise. For several days, Delhi descended into violence and plunder. Nader's troops ransacked the city, looting homes, palaces, temples, and mosques. Contemporary sources report that tens of thousands perished in the chaos. The peacock throne, the bejeweled symbol of Mughal authority, was taken. So was the Koh-i-Noor diamond, along with untold quantities of gold, silver, and gemstones. Modern economists estimate that Nader Shah returned to Persia with wealth equivalent to hundreds of millions, if not billions in today's currency. Delhi, once the crown of the Mughal world, would never fully recover. And Nader, he returned to Persia, richer than any king alive, hailed as the second coming of Timur. But riches do not buy peace. In fact, they bought the opposite. Flush with gold and ego, Nader raised taxes. He demanded total obedience. He pushed new military campaigns into the Caucasus, into Oman, even toward China. But the more he expanded, the more he alienated his own people. His reforms grew harsher, his punishments more severe. Once loved as a warrior king, he became feared as a paranoid despot, convinced everyone around him plotted betrayal. The court thinned out, His sons rebelled. He began blinding nobles, executing generals, and raising levies that bankrupted entire regions. Persia, newly reunited, briefly prosperous, sank into exhaustion and resentment. And in 1747, the story ended the way these stories tend to: assassination by his own guards in his sleep. And just like that, the Afsharid Empire began to unravel. So what was Nader Shah? A national hero to some, a butcher to others, but above all, a reminder that military genius is not moral clarity. He restored Persia's pride at the cost of its stability. He looted one empire and broke his own in the process. His rise was meteoric, his fall absolute. But his shadow lingered. In Delhi, they still remember. In Iran, they still debate. And across the vast historical sweep of monarchs and emperors, his name remains a warning that conquest without restraint always collapses inward. Yet long before Nader took Delhi, another emperor from the earliest days of Chinese imperial history had already written the rulebook on how to build an empire out of fear, labor, and absolute control. His name was Sui Emperor Yang, and his dream of greatness would drown under the weight of bridges, roads, and the bones of the people who built them. Sui Emperor Yang. In the great sweep of Chinese imperial history, certain rulers leave behind monuments, others leave behind trauma. Sui Emperor Yang, who reigned from 604 to 618 CE, somehow managed to leave. His canals still exist. His roads, in altered forms, remain. His legacy, however, is a cautionary tale told in the language of collapse. Because where his engineers carved rivers through mountains, his policies carved misery into the flesh of an empire. And unlike the emperors who came after him, those who broke the world in war or tried to stitch it back together with reform, Emperor Yang's greatest mistake wasn't ambition, it was proportionality. He did not miscalculate what was possible, he miscalculated what was survivable. Let's begin with the basics. Emperor Yang, born Yang Guang, was the second ruler of the Sui dynasty, a short-lived but foundational regime that rose from the rubble of China's long-divided north and south. His father, Sui, Emperor Wen, had done the hard part, reunifying China in 589 CE after nearly 4 centuries of fragmentation. The Sui were meant to be China's great restart. They centralized bureaucracy, restructured taxation, standardized legal codes, all the raw ingredients for dynastic longevity. And then came the son. Yang Guang's early reputation was gilded, educated, refined, fluent in statecraft. He was a favorite at court, charming the bureaucratic elite with a polish rare among hereditary rulers. When he succeeded his father amid mysterious circumstances that many historians still side-eye, he inherited an empire that was not yet fully formed, but promising. And for a brief moment, he built on that promise. He ordered the construction of the Grand Canal, a monumental project connecting the fertile south to the political north. Over 1,000 miles long, it was one of the most ambitious infrastructure efforts in human history. It would facilitate trade, troop movement, tax grain delivery, a civilizational artery. He also extended roads, standardized grain storage systems, and promoted cultural integration between once divided regions. On paper, he looked like a reformer, a visionary, a second Qin Shi Huang with fewer tombs and more shipping lanes. But then came the cost. These projects required labor in numbers that defied logistical sanity. The emperor conscripted millions of peasants to work on canals, palaces, and fortifications, often forcibly, often without pay, and often for months or years at a time. Men died in droves from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and exposure. Families were left without sons, villages without labourers, and in a system that already leaned heavily on rural taxation, this mass conscription hollowed out the countryside. And yet, the emperor didn't stop. Flush with confidence, he launched military campaigns against the Goguryeo kingdom in Korea, not once, not twice, but 3 times, starting in 612 CE. He imagined a swift and glorious conquest, one that would bolster his prestige and secure the northeast frontier. What he got instead was disaster. The first invasion involved a massive army, possibly over 1 million strong, a logistical nightmare by any standard. The supply lines broke, the soldiers starved, the Goguryeo defences held. By the time the retreat began, much of the army had already died. The second and third campaigns fared no better. Soldiers mutinied, generals hesitated. Each failure was costlier than the last, not just in men, but in morale. The empire began to fracture, not from foreign invasion, but from internal despair. Peasant uprisings erupted. Local governors declared autonomy. The economy buckled under the weight of war debt and disrupted agriculture. The very infrastructure that had been meant to unify the realm now served as pathways for rebellion. By 617 CE, the empire was in open revolt. And Yang Guang, he was still building. In one of the more chilling ironies of his reign, even as provinces declared independence and armies abandoned their posts, Emperor Yang continued commissioning palaces and pleasure boats. His court became a theatre of denial, where dissent was punished and bad news filtered through increasingly sycophantic advisors. It was as if he believed the rituals of power could substitute for its reality. He was eventually overthrown by one of his own generals while hiding out in the south. According to some sources, he was strangled in his sleep. Others say he was assassinated during a mutiny. However it happened, he died in 618, unceremoniously, anonymously, far from the halls of the capital he had tried to immortalize. The Sui dynasty ended with him. It had lasted just 37 years. But it left behind a template, one that the Tang dynasty would adopt, refine, and expand upon. Many of Emperor Yang's policies were later continued successfully, just without the extremes. The Grand Canal would become one of China's most vital economic arteries for centuries. The centralized bureaucracy he enforced would shape governance long after his death. So what does that leave us with? A man who burned the house down to renovate it, then blamed the smoke for choking his guests. A ruler whose obsession with control led him to overreach at every turn until the very ground beneath him gave way. But just as Yang Guang drowned his empire in construction and conquest, another royal across the Indian subcontinent was doing the opposite. He ruled with tolerance. He courted diversity. He styled himself not just as emperor, but as philosopher king. His name was Akbar, and his greatness came not from what he built, but from what he tried to hold together. Akbar, Mughal Emperor. In a landscape where power was often enforced by sword and solidified through suppression, Akbar the Great took an unorthodox approach. He ruled an empire by inviting people in, not metaphorically, literally. His court was a mosaic of theologians, poets, courtiers, scholars, and generals from every major faith and ethnic group under the Mughal Sunday: Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Parsis, Jesuits. Everyone got a seat at the table. It wasn't democracy, but it was about as pluralistic as the 16th century got. And yet, here's the twist. His reign was soaked in conquest, unified by blood, rooted in campaigns that crushed resistance, broke ancient kingdoms, and, yes, left hundreds of thousands dead. For all his open-mindedness, Akbar did not unify India through ideas alone. He did it through relentless expansion and then wrapped that expansion in the language of philosophy. He became the most successful Mughal emperor not by avoiding violence, but by controlling when and how it was used, and reframing it as destiny. Let's rewind. Born in 1542 in the Rajput stronghold of Umarkot, Akbar was the grandson of Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, and the son of Humayun, a ruler more known for losing empires than holding them. When Humayun died in 1556 after falling down a flight of library stairs, an exit as poetic as it was poorly timed, the empire was fragile. Akbar was just 13. But even as a teenager, he began the work of consolidating what his forebears had only partially held. He did not start with diplomacy. He started with war. The first decades of Akbar's reign were an almost uninterrupted string of military campaigns. He crushed the Afghans in Bihar and Bengal. He subdued the Rajput states, a feat that many had failed for centuries. Kingdom after kingdom fell, from Gujarat in the west to Orissa in the east. He pushed into the Deccan. He faced rebellions and defeated them. He built a military machine that was not just disciplined, but flexible, able to incorporate cavalry, artillery, and diverse regional forces under a single command structure. Casualties? Hard to pin down. But when you're consolidating most of the Indian subcontinent, the human cost is immense. Modern historians estimate that in Akbar's wars of expansion over the course of 3 decades, hundreds of thousands likely perished from combat, famine, displacement, and related fallout. Entire regions were reshaped, forcibly or otherwise, to fit the Mughal mold. And yet, Akbar's brilliance wasn't just that he conquered, it was what he did after. Where most kings would enforce religious orthodoxy, Akbar moved in the opposite direction. He famously abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims in 1564, a move that, while politically calculated, sent a shockwave through the empire. He repealed pilgrimage taxes. He banned forced conversions. He married Hindu princesses and treated their families not as subordinates, but as allies. He even founded the Ibadat Khana, or House of Worship, in Fatehpur Sikri, a space for open interfaith dialogue. It wasn't performative. He actually listened. Jesuit missionaries from Goa were invited to discuss Christian theology. Jain monks debated Vedic philosophy. Sunni and Shia scholars squared off. Akbar himself eventually developed his own spiritual ideology, Din-e-Ilahi, a syncretic faith meant to transcend traditional religion. It never took off. It didn't have to. Akbar wasn't building a religion. He was building a state of mind, a way to hold together a deeply diverse empire without constant violence. And for a time, it worked. His administration became known for meritocratic principles. He built an intricate mansabdari system, assigning military and bureaucratic ranks based on service, not just lineage. He standardized tax collection through land surveys, a massive bureaucratic feat. He sponsored art, architecture, translation projects, and one of the richest cultural revivals in Mughal history. But Akbar was no pacifist. His campaigns in Gujarat, Bengal, and the Deccan were devastating. Cities were besieged, local rulers decapitated literally and politically. The Mughal style of conquest was swift, symbolic, and thorough. While Akbar often spared defeated rulers and gave them administrative posts, those who resisted too long were left with nothing. Even in victory, Mughal governance was hierarchical and absolute. There was tolerance, but it flowed from the top down, never sideways. And despite his image as a secular thinker, Akbar never lost sight of imperial consolidation. He surrounded himself with loyalists, co-opted rivals, and turned potential threats into dependent allies. When necessary, he cracked down, sometimes brutally, on disloyal governors or rebellious provinces. Peace was precious, but it was enforced. He died in 1605, having ruled for nearly half a century. His empire stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal. His son Jahangir would inherit the throne, but not the same instincts. Over time, the inclusiveness Akbar cultivated would erode under later rulers, most notably Aurangzeb, who returned the empire to stricter orthodoxy and faced rebellion after rebellion for it. So who was Akbar? An empire builder with a philosopher's mask? A conqueror with a conscience? A tyrant in scholar's clothing? Maybe all three. He wielded violence and virtue as a dual arsenal. He inspired loyalty not through fear alone, but through curiosity about people, ideas, systems, the future. But perhaps his greatest accomplishment was this. In an age where kings burned books and banned thought, Akbar asked questions. And in doing so, he gave the Mughal Empire a golden age. Still, empires are not eternal, and across the steppes, a different dynasty, led by a boy emperor with a legacy of silk and gunpowder, was trying to do the same. Hold it all together. His name was Kangxi, and the rebellion he crushed would test whether loyalty could be purchased or if it had to be burned into the earth. Kangxi Emperor, King Dynasty. The Qingxi Emperor came to the throne wearing silken suspicion, just 8 years old when he inherited the crown of the Qing dynasty in 1661. He was too young to wield power, but not too young to be a symbol. The Manchu court placed him on the dragon throne after a brief regency, hoping to stabilize their grip on a China they had only recently conquered. But what no one fully expected was that this boy, born into a ruling minority and surrounded by potential mutiny, would become one of the longest reigning and most formidable emperors in Chinese history. And behind his poetry, Confucian scholarship, and scientific curiosity, Kangxi knew how to wage war not just on rebels and borders, but on the very idea of division itself. Let's back up. The Qing dynasty had replaced the Ming in the mid-17th century, but it wasn't a clean handoff. The Ming didn't so much fall as fracture, bleeding into dozens of regional warlords, pretenders, pirates, and resistors. When the Manchus, the ethnic minority from the northeast, took Beijing in 1644, they didn't inherit an empire. They inherited a fire. And it burned in provinces, in temples, and in the minds of Han Chinese who still saw the Qing as foreign occupiers. Into this volatile mix stepped the revolt of the three feudatories, arguably the greatest internal threat to Qing rule during Kangxi's reign. The three feudatories were former Ming generals who had defected to the Qing and had been rewarded with vast, semi-autonomous territories in the south and southwest of China. Their names, Wu Sangui, Shan Jixin, and Geng Jingzhong. Together, they controlled more land, troops, and tax revenue than the central government itself. Initially, this arrangement had worked barely as a pragmatic compromise to keep the peace, but it was always a ticking bomb. In 1673, when Kangxi was still solidifying his grip on power as a young adult, Wu Sangui requested to retire and surrender his territory. Kangxi, thinking this was a blessing in disguise, agreed. That, it turned out, was a mistake. Wu didn't retire. He rebelled, and the other two followed. What followed was a 10-year civil war, 1673-1681, that spanned southern China, dragging the empire back into chaos just as it had begun to stabilize. The three feudatories marshaled their private armies, reasserted their autonomy, and styled themselves as the true protectors of Chinese culture against what they painted as Manchu tyranny. It was less a coup than an unmaking of the state, a fracturing of the fragile unity that the Qing had stitched together. Kangxi's response was measured, then absolute. At first, he tried diplomacy. Then, he tightened tax policies. Finally, when it became clear the rebellion had legs, he declared total war. The Qing mobilized enormous forces to crush the revolt, slowly clawing back cities and provinces through siege warfare, attrition, and psychological operations. Key to the Qing strategy was divide and conquer, convincing some rebels to switch sides, isolating others, and exploiting regional rivalries. Wu Sangui declared himself emperor of a new dynasty Zhou, but died before he could consolidate it. His successors couldn't hold the line. By 1681, the revolt was dead, and the Qing had retaken southern China. But it had cost them. Modern estimates suggest that the conflict resulted in hundreds of thousands to possibly over 1 million deaths between combat, famine, disease, and scorched earth reprisals. Cities were emptied, farmland abandoned, and entire regions destabilized. It was one of the deadliest episodes of 17th century Chinese history, overshadowed only by earlier cataclysms like the Ming collapse or later upheavals like the Taiping Rebellion. And yet, Kangxi emerged not just intact, but empowered. With the feudatories gone, he abolished the semi-independent military zones that had plagued Qing control. He centralized power like no Qing ruler before him. He built a system of imperial examinations, census tracking, and fiscal reform that tethered even the most remote provinces to the throne. The empire had nearly broken, but now it was bound together tighter than ever. This was not the end of Kangxi's military campaigns. He moved on to deal with threats in Mongolia, Tibet, and along the Russian border. He negotiated the Treaty of Nerchinsk with the Romanovs in 1689, the first formal diplomatic agreement between China and a European power. He wasn't just putting out fires, he was redefining sovereignty. But Kangxi's genius wasn't just military or administrative, it was also narrative. He commissioned histories, sponsored Confucian classics, and branded himself not just as a Manchu ruler, but as a Chinese sage emperor. He cultivated the image of benevolence but never forgot the price of disobedience. The revolt of the three feudatories had shown him what fragmented power could do. He would never allow it again. So how do you rule over a continent-sized empire, divided by language, culture, geography, and history? If you're Kangxi, you crush rebellion, then make it disappear. You build roads where fires once burned. You rewrite textbooks. You reframe resistance as treason, then treason as memory, and finally, memory as myth. The empire would survive because there would be no alternative. But even Kangxi couldn't prevent what came later. His heirs would struggle to match his administrative clarity. The 18th and 19th centuries would see the Qing rot from the inside, slowly until rebellion would return in a form even Kangxi couldn't have imagined. And long before that moment, in a very different imperial capital, an emperor named Qin Shi Huang was already laying the groundwork for that same dream. A unified state, a central language, one ruler. But he didn't bother with tolerance. He preferred stone, fire, walls, and silence. Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of China. The story of Qin Shi Huang, born Yingzheng, begins like a myth, but ends like a cautionary tale. He is remembered as the first emperor of a unified China, the man who took a patchwork of rival kingdoms and stitched them into one political body. Yet, for all his accomplishments, and they were monumental, his reign was a paradox. He unified by breaking, built by burning, and imagined eternity while barely surviving 50 years of life. He ruled not as a caretaker, but as an architect of control. And like all such architects, he used people as his bricks. Let's set the stage. For centuries before Qin Shi Huang, China had been mired in the Warring States period, a time when 7 major kingdoms, plus countless smaller fiefdoms, fought in endless cycles of alliance, betrayal, and war. It was an era of philosophers and generals, of Confucius and Sun Tzu, but also of battlefield carnage on a scale that rivals any ancient conflict in the world. The Qin state, located in the rugged west, was considered semi-barbaric by its neighbors. But that very roughness gave it advantages: disciplined armies, legalist administrators, and rulers willing to prioritize efficiency over tradition. By the time Ying Zhang became king of Qin in 246 BCE, his state had already been sharpened into a weapon. He simply pointed it outward. Over the next 2 decades, Qin armies crushed one rival after another. Zhao, Han, Wei, Chu, Yan, Qi, all fell. His generals didn't just win battles, they erased dynasties. By 221 BCE, the warring states were no more. Ying Zhang declared himself not king, not duke, but something new: Huangdi Emperor. He was the first to use the title, and from then on, every ruler of China for 2 millennia would sit in the shadow of his precedent. But conquest was only the beginning. Qin Shi Huang wanted not just a unified territory, but a unified identity. He abolished feudal titles and replaced them with a centralized bureaucracy. He standardized weights, measures, currency, and even axle widths, ensuring that carts across the empire could fit neatly into the same ruts on new imperial roads. He mandated a single writing system, transforming communication across vast distances. He codified legalist principles into governance, emphasizing strict laws, harsh punishments, and absolute obedience. In short, he didn't just unify land, he unified life. And the price was staggering. The massive labor projects he initiated: roads, canals, palaces, and most famously, the Great Wall's early foundations required human effort on a scale that defies comprehension. Millions were conscripted into service. Farmers were pulled from their fields to build fortifications. Prisoners were sentenced to construction instead of execution. The toll was high. Famine spread where laborers had been taken, families collapsed, and countless workers died on sight, buried anonymously within the very stones they laid. But Qin Shi Huang wasn't finished. Obsessed with legacy, he ordered the creation of a burial complex unlike anything the world had ever seen. Beneath a massive mound near modern Xi'an lay his mausoleum, complete with rivers of mercury and an army of terracotta warriors, each uniquely sculpted, standing guard for eternity. If his empire someday fell, his afterlife empire would endure. At least, that was the plan. And yet, even as he looked toward eternity, he feared mortality. In the later years of his reign, Qin Shi Huang became obsessed with finding an elixir of immortality. He sent envoys across seas in search of mythical islands and consulted alchemists who prescribed mercury pills, ironically poisoning the emperor in his pursuit of everlasting life. By the time he died in 210 BCE, he was still wandering, still searching, still unwilling to accept that all walls eventually crumble. His death revealed the fragility of everything he built. The Qin dynasty collapsed just 4 years later, undone by the very harshness that had given it strength. The centralized bureaucracy was too rigid, the legalist punishments too cruel, the labor demands too exhausting. Rebellion spread like wildfire, and by 206 BCE, the dynasty was gone, replaced by the Han, who would keep many of Qin Shi Huang's reforms, but soften them just enough to last. So what do we make of him? To many, he is a hero, the founder of China, the man who made one out of many. To others, he is a tyrant, a ruler who burned books, buried scholars, and treated human beings as disposable infrastructure. Both are true. He was a unifier and a destroyer, a visionary and a despot. His empire was short-lived, but his model endured. Every dynasty after him was, in some way, living in Qin Shi Huang's blueprint. And perhaps that's his greatest paradox. He dreamed of immortality, failed, and yet achieved it anyway, not in body, but in influence. But if Qin Shi Huang left a legacy written in stone, the next ruler on our list carved his name across continents. A Macedonian king, barely out of his teens, whose ambition stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, leaving cities in his name like breadcrumbs across the ancient world. His name was Alexander the Great, and the question that still lingers isn't whether he conquered the world, but whether the world ever truly recovered. Alexander the Great, King of Macedon. Few rulers in history have been wrapped in more myth than Alexander III of Macedon, better known by the name history gifted him, Alexander the Great. His legend is so colossal that it is often hard to see the man behind it. Was he a visionary military genius, a reckless conqueror, a philosopher in armor, or simply a young man who set the world on fire because he couldn't bear to stay still? Whatever the answer, his campaigns rewrote the map of the ancient world, and they did it at a cost measured not only in land gained, but in human lives lost by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. His empire, built in a single decade, was as much a trail of ruins as it was of glory. Born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon, Alexander grew up under the shadow of two towering influences, his father, King Philip II, and his tutor, Aristotle. From Philip, he inherited military ambition and the dream of Pan-Hellenic conquest. From Aristotle, he learned philosophy, literature, and a taste for ideas about universalism. From the start, Alexander was both warrior and thinker, conqueror and dreamer, the kind of man who could destroy a city and then weep over a verse from Homer. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE, Alexander inherited not just the throne, but also his father's unfinished project, the invasion of the Persian Empire. At just 20 years old, he marched into history. What followed was less a war than a cascade of victories. At Granicus, 334 BCE, Alexander crushed Persian satrapal forces in Asia Minor. At Issus, 333 BCE, he faced King Darius III himself and won. By the time of Gaugamela, 331 BCE, where Alexander's army defeated Darius's vast host through tactical brilliance, the Achaemenid Empire, which had ruled for 2 centuries, effectively collapsed. Alexander marched into Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, taking capitals as though they were stepping stones. At Persepolis, the ceremonial center of Persian kingship, his troops set fire to the palace. Whether it was an accident, drunken revelry, or deliberate symbolism remains debated. But what is not debated is that one of the greatest treasures of the ancient world was lost forever, and with it countless lives and livelihoods tied to its economy. Alexander's armies were small by modern standards, often around 40,000 men, but their campaigns caused devastation far beyond the battlefield. Cities were besieged and sacked, populations displaced, agricultural systems disrupted. Ancient sources are unreliable with numbers, but historians estimate that hundreds of thousands, possibly even into the millions, died during his conquests, whether by direct combat, famine, or disease that trailed behind the marching phalanxes. Take Tyre, for instance. In 332 BCE, the island city resisted Alexander for 7 months. When it finally fell, thousands were killed and tens of thousands more enslaved. Or Gaza, where resistance ended in a similar bloodbath. Each conquest sent shockwaves across the region, both awe and terror, cementing Alexander's reputation not only as invincible, but also as merciless to those who defied him. Most conquerors would have stopped after taking the largest empire of their age, not Alexander. He pushed further into Central Asia through the mountains of modern Afghanistan into India. His army, exhausted but loyal, followed him into the Punjab, where at the Battle of the Hydaspes, 326 BCE, he faced King Porus and his war elephants. The battle was brutal, the victory decisive, but it marked the outer edge of his ambition. Here, his troops finally refused to go further. They were weary of endless campaigning, of the deaths, of being strangers in every land. Alexander, furious but pragmatic, turned back. Yet even the retreat was costly, crossing the Gedrosian desert, where thirst and starvation killed thousands. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon, he had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. But empires are not simply maps. They are people, and people do not shift identities overnight. Local rebellions simmered, administrators clashed. Alexander's attempts to merge cultures through intermarriage, the founding of cities, and the adoption of Persian customs were resented by both Macedonians and Persians. And then, in 323 BCE, at just 32 years old, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon. The cause remains one of history's mysteries: illness, poisoning, or complications from years of campaign and stress. Whatever the truth, his death shattered his empire instantly. His generals, the Diadochi, carved it into pieces. His dream of a united world order dissolved into another cycle of wars. So what was Alexander's legacy? He spread Hellenistic culture across Asia, blending Greek and local traditions in ways that shaped philosophy, science, and art for centuries. He founded cities, most famously Alexandria in Egypt, that became centers of learning. His campaigns opened east and west to each other in unprecedented ways. But he also left behind trails of destruction, shattered cities, disrupted economies, depopulated regions. His victories came at a human cost that cannot be neatly quantified, only felt in the silence of those who didn't survive to tell their story. Alexander wanted immortality, and in one sense, he got it. He is remembered as great. But the millions whose lives were consumed by his ambition? They are forgotten, absorbed into the background of his myth. And that is the paradox of Alexander, the man who conquered the world, but could not conquer himself, his own restlessness, his own need to push further, no matter the cost. Yet his was not the last empire to shatter Asia with such force. Centuries later, another monarch would preside over a conflict so vast, so industrialized, that the death toll reached into the tens of millions. His name was Hirohito, Emperor of Japan, and his silence would echo across the Pacific. Hirohito, Emperor of Japan. If Alexander's legend was forged in lightning campaigns across continents, Hirohito's legacy was forged in silence. Unlike the young Macedonian king who charged into battle at the front of his phalanx, Hirohito sat behind palace walls, behind ritual, behind ceremony. Yet his reign oversaw one of the deadliest periods in modern history. The paradox is unavoidable. The emperor who barely spoke publicly, who cloaked himself in mystique, presided over a war that consumed tens of millions of lives across Asia and the Pacific. Born in 1901, Hirohito became emperor in 1926, inheriting the chrysanthemum throne during a moment when Japan stood at a crossroads. On one hand, it was a modern constitutional monarchy, modelled on European powers, with a parliament, political parties, and a semblance of liberal institutions. On the other hand, it was still steeped in feudal hierarchy and imperial myth, with the emperor cast not as a man, but as a living god, the direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Hirohito, quiet, studious, and more comfortable with marine biology than with politics, seemed like an unlikely figure to stand at the center of what was to come. But monarchs don't always choose the shape of their reigns. Sometimes history chooses for them. Japan in the early 20th century was a rising power, having already defeated China in 1895 and Russia in 1905. The victories shocked the world, an Asian power defeating European empires. But victory also fed ambition. Military leaders increasingly saw Japan as destined to dominate Asia, while civilian politicians found themselves marginalized. By the late 1922nd and 1932nd, a combination of economic crises, nationalism, and militarism pushed Japan toward expansionism. The turning point was 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria. The civilian government hesitated, the international community protested, but the military moved forward anyway. Hirohito's role in this, as in much of his reign, remains debated. Some historians argue he was complicit, giving tacit approval. Others claim he was pressured, boxed in by generals. What's undeniable is that his throne provided legitimacy. The empire's soldiers marched under banners proclaiming loyalty to the emperor. Every campaign, every conquest, was framed as an extension of his divine authority. In 1937, full-scale war erupted between Japan and China. It would last 8 years, overlapping with the wider conflict of World War II, and remain one of the bloodiest wars in history. Japanese forces swept across northern and eastern China, capturing cities and triggering refugee crises on a staggering scale. Civilian populations were bombed, crops were destroyed, entire regions starved. The death toll? Still debated, but most historians place it in the tens of millions, primarily Chinese civilians. Whether through direct violence, famine, disease, or forced labor, the war hollowed out communities across East Asia. Hirohito's name was invoked constantly in military orders, rituals, and propaganda. Soldiers were told they were fighting in his honor, and yet Hirohito himself remained distant, issuing imperial rescripts filled with lofty abstractions but rarely, if ever, addressing the human reality. His silence was not neutral. It was political theater. By 1941, Japan's ambitions expanded further. Seeking resources and dominance, it struck at Western colonies in Southeast Asia and at the United States at Pearl Harbor. The war that followed the Pacific theater of World War II stretched from Burma to Hawaii, engulfing islands, oceans, and millions of lives. The fighting was relentless. Battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became bywords for destruction. Civilians were trapped in sieges, bombings, and forced relocations. In Southeast Asia, millions more died from famine caused by the disruption of rice supplies and colonial structures. By war's end in 1945, the scale of devastation across Asia was staggering. Conservative estimates place Chinese losses alone at 10 to 20 million. Add Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, and the Pacific, and the total climbs much higher. And Hirohito? He remained enshrined in distance. He received detailed military briefings. He signed off on key decisions. He was informed of atrocities and of Japan's deteriorating position. But in public, he projected calm detachment. The generals ruled in his name. The cabinet justified war as his will. He embodied the paradox of modern monarchy, absolute in symbolism, elusive in accountability. By the summer of 1945, Japan was collapsing. Cities were firebombed to ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by atomic bombs. The Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. And only then did Hirohito finally break his silence. On the 15th of August, 1945, in his first ever radio broadcast, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender. His voice high, formal, almost otherworldly, was the first many Japanese had ever heard. He never used the word defeat. Instead, he said Japan would endure the unendurable to save civilization from destruction. For millions across Asia, the war's end came too late. For Hirohito, it was only the beginning of a new paradox. Unlike many Axis leaders, Hirohito was not tried as a war criminal. U.S. occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, decided to preserve the monarchy as a stabilizing symbol. Hirohito renounced his divinity in 1946 but remained on the throne until his death in 1989. He became a constitutional monarch, ribbon-cutting and wave-giving, while Japan reinvented itself as a democracy and economic powerhouse. But the shadow never disappeared. Was he a powerless figurehead, trapped by his generals, or was he an active participant, quietly guiding decisions while letting others take the blame? The debate rages on. Documents, testimonies, and interpretations vary. What remains certain is that his reign coincided with the deaths of tens of millions, one of the greatest human catastrophes in modern history. So how should history remember Hirohito? As a symbol of tradition? As a man who shielded himself with ritual while the empire he represented committed devastation? As a survivor who adapted from god to figurehead? Perhaps all of these, but above all, he remains the embodiment of how silence itself can be deadly. Because sometimes the greatest violence isn't in the shout of a general or the clash of an army. Sometimes it's in the quiet assent of a ruler who never says no. And with Hirohito, our list closes a journey from ancient conquerors to modern emperors, from those who swung swords to those who signed decrees, 30 rulers, 30 shadows across history. Each left legacies built on ambition and ruin, glory and grief. Each claimed the throne, and each, in their own way, showed that monarchy, for all its pageantry, is never innocent.